All right, good morning, everyone. Oh, sorry, that's so loud. Good to have the amplification. I'm losing my voice a bit, so apologies if I'm hard to understand. How's that? Good? Volume good? All right, I'm Salil Vadan. I'm the lead PI on the Privacy Tools project. It's great to see you all here, having made it despite all the ice on the ground. I will be giving a little bit of an overview of the Privacy Tools project, telling you a little bit about our goals, give you a little preview of some of the work that you'll be hearing about later in the day, and tell you, reflect a little bit on some of the lessons we learned through this effort, and a little bit about what we hope to get out of today's workshop. So let me start with what was the original motivation that sparked us to work on the Privacy Tools project. And that was the revolution that was happening in the social sciences due to the vast array of new sources of data on human behavior and interactions enabled by technology and the internet. And our understanding that a major obstacle to realizing the full potential of data-driven, quantitative, computational social science was privacy. Many of these new data sets contain sensitive information about people, and researchers have an ethical and legal obligation to protect the privacy of their data subjects. So why is this such a problem? Well, with data at coming in at such great scale, what's also needed are scalable ways and easy ways for sharing the data to enable the kind of replication and verification of research results and secondary analysis that's so crucial to the advancement of science. For example, by posting data sets on public open repositories, which there's been a very big push in open data movements to do. Of course, but for privacy sensitive data, you cannot just publish it, post it publicly, and make it free for others to verify your work and analyze. And so privacy comes into conflict with one of the important pillars of data-driven research, and that is open sharing of data. And unfortunately, the traditional techniques for dealing with such privacy concerns, such as stripping so-called personally identifying information, by now are well understood to be ineffective and problematic. If you only remove obvious identifiers from a data set, for example, removing names and addresses and so on, it's often still possible to figure out who's who in the data set from the other information that remains. And so you've only made it slightly harder for someone who wants to violate privacy with one of these data sets. On the other hand, if you aggressively de-identify a data set to try to make it really difficult to identify individuals, you often are forced to greatly. So in cartoon form, the goals of the Privacy Tools project were to try to reconcile these privacy concerns with open data and try to push this privacy versus utility curve out as much as possible. And we have been trying to do this through the collaboration of kind of 4 different disciplines. Of course, the social scientists and data scientists who collect and analyze and share these data sets that we're referring to.
What are you needing, sorry?
Yeah.
Sorry for the delay.
To make it lower.
All right, how's that? Can you hear me okay?
Awesome.
Okay, great. Okay, so the social scientists and data scientists who are collecting, analyzing, and sharing these privacy-sensitive data sets. Computer science, which over the past decade has been greatly studying the problem and developing new models and algorithmic methods for enabling the analysis of privacy-sensitive data sets in a way that provides strong protections of privacy to the data subjects. And law and policy, which gives us an understanding of the legal and ethical obligations of researchers for protecting privacy. To enable this, we have been working with several interdisciplinary centers that already exist here at Harvard. The Center for Research on Computation and Society, which is based here in the School of Engineering and Computer Science. The Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society, a university center that was founded at Harvard Law School. The Institute for Quantitative Social Science, another university center founded in the government department, which itself houses the Data Privacy Lab, which is a long history of looking at the interaction between such privacy problems, technology, and law, as well as the Program on Information Science at MIT Libraries. And the target for our efforts has been on understanding the problems and the interventions that can be applied for data repositories. For example, repositories such as this one that are using the Dataverse software infrastructure for hosting repositories developed by the Institute for Quantitative Social Science, one of the centers working on this project. Dataverse, there are Dataverse repositories all around the world, 27 different installations, and the Dataverse repository here at Harvard is by some counts the largest repository of social science data in the world. And so this gives us an opportunity to immediately have a large impact with our work, because if we can develop methods that can be applied to Dataverse repositories, we can immediately deploy it to all those that use these repositories. Unfortunately, at least as we were starting this project, Dataverse repositories, like most data repositories, not really equipped to take on privacy-sensitive data. So researchers, typically when they upload a data set, have to assert that there are no privacy problems associated with it. And when there are privacy concerns, such as on these data sets here, shown with a lock icon, there is no button to download those data sets. They're not made freely available for others. And the only way to get access to such data is by a manual application process, which can often be lengthy and time-consuming, involving the original researcher who collected the data set, if they are still even accessible, institutional review boards, and sometimes months of negotiation between the institutions involved. Okay, and so our goal is to enable wider sharing of such data sets while providing strong protections of privacy for the data subjects. Okay, so what are the challenges? I've already talked about the traditional approaches to de-identifying data sets being understood to be ineffective, starting with the work of one of our co-PIs, LaTanya Sweeney, in the late 90s. This very inefficient process for obtaining access to sensitive data sets. And finally, another obstacle for researchers sharing sensitive data is that it's very difficult to navigate the thousands of laws that may constrain the way in which they can share and handle a privacy-sensitive data set. Okay, and so our goal is or our vision is that there should be an array of computational, legal, and policy tools that make the privacy-protective sharing of sensitive data easier for researchers who need not have expertise in privacy, law, computer science, or statistics. Right, so everyone who has such a data set shouldn't need access to a specialized expert in data privacy in order to be able to safely share their data. Okay, and the way we're approaching this is trying to develop an array of integrated privacy tools that, again, intervene at a data repository at the point that someone comes to deposit a sensitive data set into a repository, such as a Dataverse repository. And what we envision is that in the first step, the researcher will go through an interview process, data tags interview, that helps them understand the constraints on the handling of their data, coming from law and ethical obligations and the consent agreements that they've used and so on. Okay, and currently, in many cases, it will be deemed, these will be given some kind of iconic data tag that indicates a policy for how the data should be handled. And in many cases, for sensitive data, they would get a tag, in this case red, that indicates that the data cannot be shared freely and can only be stored securely on the repository. But of course, we still want to make data available. And as in the current process, qualified researchers who agree to appropriate terms should be able to get access to the data for replication and secondary analysis. And we would like to make this process more efficient as well. And so we envision a robot lawyers tool that removes a lot of the current manual negotiation that needs to happen and can generate in a rather automated way a custom license or data use agreement that researchers will need to agree to and meet the terms of in order to obtain access to the data. And finally, I mentioned in computer science, there's been a large body of work on how to enable safe analysis of sensitive data sets. And so we're developing tools that bring this theory of what's called differential privacy to enable statistical analysis to a wide population of sensitive data sets. So even those, before one goes through the process of applying for access, direct access to the raw data, one can obtain statistical information and perform exploratory analysis of a sensitive data set using these tools. Okay, you'll hear more about all of these things as the day goes on. In particular, in the next talk, Mercedes will talk more about these data tags tool for generating policies for the handling of a sensitive data set. This afternoon, Micah Altman will talk about the robot lawyers tools, which are at an earlier stage, and this is why they're kind of in the future direction section of the program, an earlier stage of development that enable generating these custom data use agreements and licenses using the methodology of logic programming from computer science. And later in this session, or maybe the beginning of next session, due to some technical difficulties, James Honaker will talk about the tools we're building for incorporating differential privacy. Okay. In addition, there's one piece that isn't yet reflected on this picture, is that how do you go from the legal requirements as encapsulated in things such as data tags and robot lawyers to the mathematical models of privacy that something like differential privacy talks about. And so we've also been engaged in bridging work, in bridging the way the law understands privacy with the way computer scientists, mathematicians, and statisticians have been modeling and thinking about privacy, and in order to make an argument that these tools should satisfy those legal requirements. And conversely, so Alexandra Wood will be talking about that later in the session, and conversely, Urs Gasser will talk about going in the other direction, how we should be using technology as a way to reimagine what the legal solution space for dealing with privacy problems is. Okay, so our efforts also, the number of other components to our efforts, certainly broader impacts are something that have been very important to us. So really in two threads. One is trying to bring this multidisciplinary understanding of data privacy that we've been developing and others have been developing to a wide range of audiences, including the general public and policymakers. And second, as I've already mentioned, bringing solutions to data privacy problems to practice, and our focus being on data repositories. Right? And so we achieve some of this through developing infrastructure for research that can be incorporated in data repositories. We've had a wonderful time interacting with, working with many students and interns and postdocs from many different fields. And we've also been engaged in quite a bit of joint policy commentary, bringing together the expertise from all of these different fields. In terms of reaching the general public, some of you may have attended the symposium we hosted a couple of years ago on privacy in a networked world. And Latanya Sweeney, one of our co-PIs, has also formed a new journal utilizing some of the tools that we've developed. And there's also a lot of progress that you may not hear quite as much about today, kind of on core understanding of data privacy, for example, from a mathematical or legal point of view. But what I'd like to do is use my last few minutes to talk a little bit about some of the lessons we've learned in this effort. And as you can see, it's a very long timeline. For me, really, I draw the spark all the way back to 2006, where the postdocs in the Center for Research on Computation and Society organized a series of seminars on privacy that served to open the minds of many of us who are kind of in the core of computer science to the privacy problems that were being thought about outside, as well as emerging work within computer science. This was right around the time that differential privacy was emerging. And then next, a couple of years later, CIRCUS, the Center for Research and Computation Society, and the Berkman Center had a very concerted effort to try to identify joint research directions that were of common interest to both. A data privacy working group was formed. And what I want to emphasize here in both cases is the role of these interdisciplinary centers to kind of seed efforts like this and get people together in the same room from different disciplines, and over a period of time start to understand where the common interests are and understand how the others are thinking about very similar problems. Out of this working group, we identified a motivating problem that was of interest to all of us, and this really came out of an effort to anonymize a data set on Facebook data that a Berkman fellow and others had collected and wanted to make available through Dataverse. And realizing the difficulty or even impossibility of effectively anonymizing this data set brought out a problem that all sides were really interested in addressing, and we in computer science as well realized that this is exactly what this emerging line of work on differential privacy was, the type of problem it was designed to address. All right, then another important thing to know about interdisciplinary work is that getting funding for interdisciplinary work is very hard. Writing a compelling proposal that will appeal also to an interdisciplinary panel from the perspectives of all those disciplines, very challenging. But one should not despair. These efforts also, every time you rewrite one of these proposals, serves to create a more refined vision of how you're going to work together. Thankfully, industrial research sponsors are often not as conservative as peer review panels, and we did get a small gift from Google that was really crucial in continuing our joint work. We then engaged in some joint policy commentary, which I found to be a remarkably effective vehicle. Something smaller scale and shorter term than an scholarly research publication, but that really forced us to, again, understand the perspectives of the other disciplines. We finally had this successful Nsf Frontier Proposal, which is really unusual in its breadth and size, and I think really it would not have been possible to embark on the proposal, on this work at the scale that we envisioned without this kind of support. Building a community, not just within the project, but with the wider research communities that are thinking about these kind of problems was really important to us. We did that very early on. It was very important to our efforts. And I'd also like to mention that the external critiques, even though they can be frustrating to receive at times, that we had through NSF site visits, were really important in giving us a different lens into what we're doing. Noticing ways that we aren't sometimes always collaborating as effectively as we could, or we don't, haven't thought through how we get from the research we're doing to the tools that we want to build, or maybe that we aren't engaging the students in the interdisciplinary research as much as we could. This kind of feedback was really useful for us and prompted us, for example, to form this Bridging Privacy Definitions Working Group, which you'll hear a little bit more about. And one thing that was really important there, thanks to Kobe Nassim and Alexandra Wood, who ran those efforts, was creating a safe environment where it was okay not to understand the things that the others were talking about. And finally, I'm happy to say that we've reached a point where we do have many interdisciplinary outputs, publications, work that students were involved with from multiple disciplines. And again, it takes time. This is really over a decade of effort. I won't talk so much here since I'm out of time. We also have lessons learned about the challenges in bringing theory to practice. Started out with what I think was quite reasonably a very ambitious idea for what we would be able to do, and then realized that even on much more basic things there are challenges to bringing it to practice, and those things themselves were interesting research problems, But certainly for me as a theorist, learning about these challenges in bringing theory to practice was a very informative part of the project. All right, so I should finish. Our goals for this workshop today, it's wonderful to have you all here. We want to share a little bit from our end on where we've come in this Privacy Tools project. But we also are eager to hear about, in one of the later sessions, hear about related efforts, the challenges that others are facing in sharing sensitive data and the work that they're doing to address those problems. And from this, we'd like to find new collaborations as well as people who may be interested in using some of the tools that are now maturing from our project and ready to be used. And towards the end of the day, you'll also hear about some of the directions we're headed going forward from here. And one other thing that will not be mentioned in that is that we also are very much pushing forward on taking the tools that we've been developed that are now advanced research prototypes and really turning them into production level tools that can be used at scale. Still looking for resources and the right collaborations to make that happen, but that is another piece of the efforts going forward. Thank you.
I'll be talking about data tags, and specifically as is it implemented in Dataverse. So in the context of this workshop, I'm this person in Salil's diagram. So this is the part that I will be describing in the talk, the data tags interview and the data tags projects as integrated with Dataverse. So I'll introduce a little bit the Dataverse software just for those who are not familiar about that. Then I'll introduce data tags, and I'll talk into more detail how do we integrate the two systems together step by step, and what does it mean for the workflow of data deposit and data access in a repository, and then a brief summary of what are our next steps and the lessons we've learned. So Dataverse. Dataverse is an open source platform for sharing, for building data repositories or sharing research data. Those repositories can be at the level of an institutional repository for the research data of the researchers in that institution or organization, or could be a consortium of institutions, like, for example, in the Texas consortium, where they support about 20 different universities within the same Dataverse installation, or it could be for a scientific community, as, for example, in the Harvard Medical School, they built using Dataverse for structural biology data, or open to the entire research community. And this is the case of Harvard Dataverse and also a few other Dataverses like the UNC, the one in the University of North Carolina, John Crabtree is here representing that. So what we built, though, when we started about more than 10 years ago building this software, it was to provide an infrastructure that would be easier for researchers to share data sets, but in a way that would also build incentives for those researchers to do so. So those incentives were based on giving a data citation for every data set that they share with others, so that others can reference it and give credit to the data authors. And we've been doing that and been very involved in the data citation principles and data citation best practices so that that happens and that not only the researchers get the data citation, but also this citation counts, and it's counted in Crossref, in DataCite, and in other organizations that are matching data sets with publications that cite that data. So all this is a work that it's not only part of Dataverse, but it's a broader community, and we're very involved with. Then there are a number of other features that the Dataverse software provides that help share the sensitive data with easily and with all what is necessary to make it again easier and make it as I will talk about findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So what is called the FAIR principles. So what those features are, for example, providing a customization for your Dataverse, be able to just have a Dataverse within a Dataverse installation that you can brand it in the way you want it or embed it in your website. Providing metadata, rich metadata that is based on standards, but also it could be extended for your needs. Also supporting versioning of these data sets. And a whole set of access controls. So not even before we implementing or we're fully integrated with data tags, we're already supporting to be able to restrict data files, even though when the metadata is public, so the data set is findable, but the files are restricted. It supports guestbooks, so that the users that want to download the data have to register and provide information before they can download the data. And also a whole set of terms of use and licensing for your data set that you can customize. And this is important, but of course, we encourage open data. So by default, the data set that you will deposit will be open and public to the entire research community. And then we provide a functionality to extract variable information from tabular data sets. And that means that if you deposit a data file that either it comes from our data frame that you've used in your platform or with our packages, you can just take that our data frame and deposit it into Dataverse, and we will automatically extract the information for every column, all the variable information. And the same for an SPSS file or from an Excel file or so. And then this actually allows to integrate with data exploration tools, because now we have variable information that you can get through the API, through an API, and be able to understand what that data file is about, what kind of information it has, and what each column contains. And of course, we support API for interoperability with other systems. So all this makes it, again, a FAIR project, compliant with the FAIR principles. For those of you who are not familiar with that, is a term that has been increasingly used in the research community, in the data sharing initiatives. Is now one of the terms that drives the NIH Data Commons. Some of you that are familiar with this. So that when we build the data commons for sharing data sets, we make sure that are findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So as Salil pointed out, this is the Dataverse is used worldwide. There are 27 installations, and those installations are federated by harvesting metadata from one repository to another. And more importantly, it has a community that is growing, contributing to the code, and also contributing to provide input of what is the direction of the software, what should be the direction of the software. And within Harvard, we host a Dataverse repository that Salil mentioned that it already, well, it has a lot of data in social science, 75,000 data sets. Some are local and some are harvested from other repositories. 25,000 of those data sets have been deposited directly to the repository. And of those, 40,000 are these tabular files where we can have extracted this variable information. And this is important because those are the type of files that tools like Psi can work with, because it has a standard format and it has a standard metadata that external data exploration or data analysis tool can use through the API. And well, we've got 2.8 million downloads since we started. And now there are 20,000 registered users in the repository with 36,000 unique visitors per month in the last year in average, and 300 new data sets per month also in average. 50% of this data in the Harvard data repository, is not in all Dataverses, is social science research data, and about 13% biomedical data. And the numbers from other disciplines are growing slowly, but like in computer science, in law, and others are providing more sharing more data with open repositories like Dataverse. So now I'll get into a data tags, and then I'll put the two together. So a data tag is, as we define it in a paper with Latanya Sweeney and Michael Barsinai, is a set of security features and access requirements for file handling. And a data tag repository is one that stores and shares data files in accordance with the standardized and ordered levels of security and access requirements. So what does this mean more specifically for a repository? Well, it has to follow these conditions. First, has to, for a data repository or a file system to support data tags, it has to support more than one data tag. If you just say, I'm supporting blue data tags, it's not enough to make it a data tag repository. Each file in the repository must have one and only one data tag. And additional requirements cannot weaken the file security and cannot require the same or more security than a more restrictive data tag. Then a recipient of the user that gets the file from a repository must satisfy the file's access requirements, produce sufficient credentials as requested, and agree to any terms of use required to acquire the file. So on all this has to be well, guaranteed by whenever you can provide technology guarantees, you should do that in order to have a data repository that supports data tags. So you should guarantee 1, 2, and 3. So in more detail, what each data tag, each one of these policies or levels says or requires. So the blue data tag, which we could describe it as public data, it doesn't set any requirements to the repository. You can store it, you can translate it clear without an encryption, and store it without encryption. And it's open, you don't need to log into or register or request access to the data. Then the green is called control public, which means that the storage still doesn't need to be encrypted, but now, and the transfer also doesn't need to be encrypted, but in this case, we do require you to register or to provide some information about who you are before you can download the file. Then as yellow is more accountable, and now in this case, the transfer needs to be encrypted. And in order to access the file now, you will need to provide a password. You need to register to the site and click through a data use agreement. The orange is encrypted storage and encrypted transit. Now you'll need to sign the data use agreement. So it is more restricted. It's more difficult to access the data. And one step more. And in the red case, you have the encrypted storage, encrypted transit, but now you have two-factor authentication, so the access is also more controlled. And the crimson, which you haven't worked very much on it yet, but it's a multi-encrypted storage, and with also two-factor authentication and signed data use agreements. So for those who are from Harvard, you may be familiar with the Harvard security levels. Much of the data tags levels were inspired by those security levels. The only thing is that the data tags also address the access requirements, not only the security requirements. And also there were a few differences. So as we saw, the security levels at Harvard, which go from 1 to 5 instead of 1 to 6, had put the de-identified data in level 1. We made that distinction that lower risk de-identified data sets you would need to at least be green data tag, because at least you need to know who accessed that data, so that you can, in the case of re-identification, you could be able to contact those users and get the data back. The other ones, the other levels, the yellow corresponds to level 2, the orange to level 3, and red to level 4, and crimson to level 5, although might be slightly different, because level 5 means it's not even in the network, and the crimson would mean a version of level 5, but on the network. So how do we integrate all these things together? First, as of now, the Dataverse repository and many other repositories, like Salil mentioned, do not support hosting sensitive data. They just make that so by just making data depositors agree to terms of use, saying that they will not deposit data sets that have sensitive information. In the Harvard Dataverse itself, as it is currently, before data tags, it says that for data users, the user uploads must be void of all identifiable information, such that re-identification of any subjects from the amalgamation of the information available from all of the materials across data sets and dataverses uploaded under any one author or user should not be possible. So if you happen to read those terms of use, this is what you're agreeing to, and you need to be careful that nobody else can re-identify your data set if they combine it with other data. The same with the Dryad data repositories, similar to Dataverse repositories. Repositories should share research data. Same for GenBank. And in different forms, the terms of use say the same. You cannot deposit sensitive information. So now, though, with data tags, we can enable this, to depositing sensitive data as long as we follow the requirements that are set by the data tag. So we start with a data file deposit, and the user, the depositor, finds the option of any of these data tags to assign to the data set. So they can go through the data tags automated interview, which will recommend which data tag should be assigned to your data file. And in some cases, they might want to also review it with the IRB or with a review or approval to make sure that they are assigning the right data tag. Then they add a data use agreement to that data tag, and the robot lawyers can play a role there. But before robot lawyers, they would still be able to customize or to add any data use agreement that goes with the data set. Now, in this case, they have an orange data tag. You could access the data file if you sign the data use agreement and you are granted access. And you, this shouldn't be two-factor authentication. And you provide a password and register to the site. Or you could access it through PSI, as James will describe. And in this case, that would correspond to a green data tag. So let's walk through quickly what that workflow means. Those are the screenshots, the mock-ups that we're doing. We have for changing Dataverse to support data tags, so that when you first create a data set, what you have as a default is a blue data tag. So your data, we assume your data is not going to be sensitive until you tell us otherwise, but we warn you, if you think your data might be sensitive, you need to go through the data tags interview and make sure that it is not before you deposit, or choose the right data tag. Then it goes through the interview. That means that you start answering. I know that that it's not, well, as visible as it is in my laptop, but when you go through this interview, it is asking you questions about what the data contains. And as you keep answering the questions, and it's tracking all your answers. And at the end, it's giving you, in this case, an orange data tag that will be the recommendation for what you need to assign to the data set. It would also provide you with a JSON file that has all the information of all the requirements that this data tag means for the data repository and for accessing the data. Then you assign that to your data set. Your data set will show that has a data tag. The data set, though, can contain other data files that are less restrictive than the orange data tag. So the data tag of the data set is the maximum restrictive data tag for all the files in your data set. And then if you cannot access the raw data, you could go through the summary statistics and at some point, perhaps run some models and get some estimations for if you're using the SCI tool with differential privacy to get those results again, accessing the private data. So what are our next steps? Well, we're implementing, I'm running out of time, so I'll go through that quickly. We're implementing this data tags integration with 5.0 of Dataverse. When this is released, the Harvard Dataverse repository will support sensitive data up to level 3 or data tags up to orange. Other repositories that use Dataverse will be able to use the Dataverse software and support the data tags as long as they have the security requirements set up in the hosting environment. And other repositories that are not Dataverse can also, of course, use data tags. So some of what we've learned and what we advise to others that are going to implement data tags is that first, the data tags security requirements might not be sufficient for what your institution requires when you have to host sensitive data in some of the servers or cloud that is hosted by your institution. So you need to make sure to review that with IT to make sure you provide all the security requirements by IT. Also, there are a number of steps in the implementation of the workflow that support data tags that involve language that needs to be reviewed by IRB, here Harvard, the Office of General Counsel, and legal experts. And that in that case, we work with Berman and the law school. And then also what we've learned is that requires a lot of usability, UI and usability research and testing, because are many steps for the user to go through and to make sure they understand clearly what is that they're doing and they're not just agreeing to anything before they deposit sensitive data. Thank you. I'm done.
Right now, though, is Alexandra Wood, speaking about bridging the gap between privacy law and policy.
Thank you. I'm pleased to share some of the results of our research to develop a modern approach to privacy law and policy. This research is motivated by a number of observations about current data sharing challenges. Namely, privacy laws vary significantly and often require case-by-case review by practitioners. And current privacy practices such as de-identification and notice and consent, which are in common use, often fail to provide reasonable privacy protection. And as a result, data are often significantly redacted or withheld altogether, restricting future uses of the data. To address these challenges, we've pursued interdisciplinary approaches that leverage expertise from computer scientists, legal scholars, and information scientists through the Privacy Tools Project, and in particular through participation in our weekly working group on bridging privacy definitions. This work has sought to transfer relevant research findings from the Privacy Tools Project, as well as insights from the technical literature, to lawyers, policymakers, and practitioners by identifying gaps in current practice, developing frameworks for combined legal technical reasoning, formulating policy frameworks and recommendations, and creating educational materials to explain technical topics to non-technical audiences. One of the main outputs from this collaboration has been a framework for modern privacy analysis. This framework was developed in response to gaps we've uncovered in the regulatory framework for privacy in the United States. For example, regulations are sector and context specific and highly variable across contexts. Practical guidance on implementing privacy safeguards in specific settings is very limited. And legal standards and implementing guidance often encourage the use of a limited set of safeguards, such as de-identification and notice and consent, rather than drawing from the wider range of privacy interventions that may be available. And these factors can lead to different actors treating similar privacy risks, in some cases even identical data sets, vastly differently. And this is an indication that the privacy framework leads to suboptimal outcomes. In our work, we've proposed a new framework that's modeled on information security approaches and a life cycle approach to data management. It involves developing a broad catalog of privacy controls, identifying the intended data uses and the components of privacy risk, including both privacy threats and vulnerabilities separately, that are specific to a particular setting, and then designing data releases that calibrate appropriate privacy controls to the intended uses and privacy risks in a particular setting. And this is done at each stage of the information lifecycle, from collection through long-term storage and use. Through this research, we've developed an extensive catalog of the privacy controls that are available, including procedural, technical, educational, economic, and legal controls that are available at each stage of the information lifecycle. We've also illustrated how this framework can be used to guide the selection of appropriate privacy controls. In this diagram that we've prepared, we show how an assessment of the identifiability of a data set or the difficulty of learning about individuals in a data set more broadly, as well as the level of expected harm from the use of the data set, point to different sets of controls that may be appropriate in a particular use case. For example, if a data set contains direct identifiers or has been transformed through simple redaction, perhaps it's appropriate to go through a formal IRB process or to access the data through a secure data enclave, depending on how sensitive the information is. But if the information has been transformed using a differentially private mechanism, perhaps the data can be shared in the clear or with notice and consent and terms of use. This approach can be used to design a tiered access mechanism, allowing data to be made available to different categories of users through different modes of release, such as open query access via differentially private tools, or protected analysis via a secure data enclave. In this way, data release mechanisms can be tailored to the risks associated with a given set of data, as well as the uses desired by different users. And you may notice how this tiered access approach is inspired by the tiered access model applied by the Privacy Tools Project's integrated toolkit being deployed in Dataverse. We've applied this framework to the analysis of real-world privacy issues and submitted recommendations in a number of regulatory proceedings and in response to requests for comments by regulatory agencies, standards bodies, and other organizations. We've also published several academic articles on topics such as open government data and commercial research ethics that applies this framework. And we're beginning to see the impact of this work within the wider policy community. For example, the article introducing this framework is referenced and its figures are reproduced in other publications, including a forthcoming report by NIST on de-identifying government data sets. And in the course of this work, we found that policymakers and privacy practitioners have limited knowledge about one of our key recommendations, the use of differential privacy. And for the remainder of this talk, I'll discuss our work in this area. One area of our research has aimed to develop educational materials to explain differential privacy to non-technical audiences. We've drafted a primer on differential privacy, and it aims to introduce the differential privacy framework to social science researchers, policymakers, lawyers, and other privacy practitioners using simplified and intuitive but mathematically accurate illustrations. These materials are intended to provide a foundation for practitioners so that they can make decisions about whether and how to analyze and share data about individuals, how to inform individuals about the privacy protection they will be afforded, and how to design policies and regulations for robust privacy protection. We've also engaged in research to bridge the gaps between differential privacy and legal standards for privacy protection. As Salil mentioned previously, this research supports the other tools being developed through the Privacy Tools Project. They also have broader policy implications. This work aims to answer whether we can claim that new technologies based on formal privacy models like differential privacy and potentially other privacy technologies can be shown to satisfy existing regulatory requirements for privacy protection. This is a challenging question because the fact that privacy regulations are context-specific, subject to interpretation, allow for some degree of flexibility, and rely on traditional, often heuristic conceptions of privacy, creates uncertainty for the real-world implementation of formal privacy models. Is it possible to bridge the gap between these very different notions of privacy from law and mathematics? We believe it is, and have developed two approaches for making such a claim. The first approach aims to rigorously argue that a technological privacy solution satisfies the requirements of a particular law. It involves two steps. First, extracting a formal mathematical requirement from the law, and second, proving mathematically that a technological solution satisfies the requirement we derive from the law. And we've illustrated the application of this approach by bridging between differential privacy and the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, or FERPA, which is the federal law protecting education records. To model the privacy desiderata of FERPA, we used a game-based privacy definition, a common approach in computer science. The game-based definition provides a concise and fairly intuitive abstraction of FERPA's requirements. And if a formal model such as differential privacy satisfies the definition we've extracted from the law, then we have a strong argument that it satisfies the requirements of FERPA. To construct a game-based definition based on FERPA, we look to the regulation, and specifically in the definition of personally identifiable information, we found this language. Personally identifiable information includes information that, alone or in combination, is linked or linkable to a specific student that would allow a reasonable person in the school community who does not have personal knowledge of the relevant circumstances to identify the student with reasonable certainty. And we take the text highlighted in blue to be FERPA's implicit adversary in our model. In developing this model, we made efforts to overcome ambiguities in the law that have led to differing interpretations of the legal requirements. For example, FERPA allows school directory information to be shared publicly. This is what makes it possible for schools to publish yearbooks and school directories. However, each school has discretion to designate information as directory information. And rather than making assumptions, which could later be shown to be incorrect, we let the attacker choose what constitutes directory information. And this is a conservative approach that strengthens our model, and it ensures that we capture a wide range of potential interpretations of the law. This approach enabled us to define a FERPA privacy game, a simplified version of which is shown here. In this simplified game, an adversary sees directory information and the result of the computation, which is passed through the mechanics of the game, and it makes a guess of the student's private information. The adversary wins the game if the guess of private information equals the actual private information. Using this game formulation, we go on to prove that differential privacy satisfies the privacy definition we've extracted from FERPA, and therefore is sufficient to satisfy a very large class of potential interpretations of FERPA. In an effort to extend our argument that differential privacy is sufficient to satisfy legal requirements for privacy protection to additional laws and policies, we've also been developing a complementary approach that aims to interpret the differential privacy guarantee in reference to privacy concepts that appear in privacy law and policy. We aim to do so in a way that accommodates differences in how these concepts are defined across contexts. I'll walk through one example using the concept of personally identifiable information as an illustration. PII is a central concept in information privacy law. Legal protections often extend only to PII, and data that do not contain PII or have been stripped of PII often receive no protection at all. Definitions of PII vary significantly based on sector, jurisdiction, and context. However, the concept is generally understood to refer to the presence of pieces of information that are linkable to the identity of an individual or to an individual's personal attributes. The use of the term PII creates challenges for the implementation of formal privacy models like differential privacy because it does not have a precise technical meaning, and in fact, interpretations can vary quite widely. As a result, it can be difficult to determine whether information is PII or may become PII in the future. Regardless of the definition of PII that is used, differential privacy can be interpreted as essentially ensuring that using an individual's data will not reveal any PII that is specific to her, where the word specific is used to refer to information that cannot be inferred unless the individual's information is used in the analysis. Through this work, we've learned that there are significant and seemingly irreconcilable gaps between computer science and legal approaches to privacy. However, we've been able to make progress through long-term collaboration in several areas, from this framework for modern privacy analysis to novel approaches to legal technical reasoning about privacy. And key to this progress has been the depth of the interdisciplinary collaboration, which is made possible by regular weekly meetings of our working group involving computer scientists, legal scholars, and social scientists in a very open, collaborative environment. We found that this is a very rich research area with a large number of potential topics to explore. And the work is continuing through the study of these and related approaches in the context of Census Bureau use cases, which Kobe Nissim will explain later today. And moving forward, we would also like to explore related topics, such as the relationship between differential privacy and contextual integrity, the relationship between differential privacy and heuristic approaches to privacy, and approaches to setting formal privacy parameters based on legal, ethical, and social definitions of privacy. While I've only been able to touch on our research very briefly, additional information can be found in our publications, which are available on the Privacy Tools website. I'm happy to take any questions.
We have time for a couple of minutes of questions while Urs sets up.
So you've done quite a lot of work trying to bridge this gap. What kind of, so I'm on the technical side, what kind of reception is it getting on the other side?
I would say that the reception has been very positive, though there's still a lot of work to be done to be able to translate these findings. The work that we've done is so different from anything that's been done before that a lot of legal scholars and policymakers lack the foundations to begin to comb through the long papers that we've written and be able to extract the insights at the level that we might hope that they would. And so I think that there's a real opportunity here to do more of this bridging work and to focus more on the translational aspects. So, you know, we've proven this to ourselves, but how can we continue to explain what we've learned to other communities?
Happy to introduce Urs Gasser, who will be talking to us about recoding privacy law. Thanks, Urs.
Thank you so much. What I would like to do is actually just to build on this last exchange and this presentation by Alex. And I would like to do so by actually zooming out and share with you a few general reflections on what I would see as the future interplay between technology, privacy, and the law. I will share that from a relatively high altitude, so bear with me. It will be a little bit more abstract than the more detailed talks we've heard about and we'll hear more about in the afternoon. But I truly do believe, and I'm quite excited about that, the project that we've been collaborating on for the past few years is really part of a larger shift, a structural shift, how we organize the interplay between technology and law/privacy. But first, let's look at the dominant narrative. Whether you look at the science cover 2 years ago or the most recent World Economic Forum report, the message we get, of course, is privacy is dead, it's over. In the age of big data, our privacy is revealed, everything is transparent. Now, if that is not enough, just open your virtual newspapers on your laptops or smartphones, and whether we're talking about the Internet of Things, augmented reality, big data, or most recently AI, the public reception, the public perception of new technology is they are an invasion into our privacy, and that's what people are concerned about. It's also what regulators are concerned about. If you look at the hearings, the workshops that are hosted by regulators in DC, but also even more so in Brussels, it is the dominant paradigm that new technology threatens our privacy. Now, that paradigm is not new per se. Actually, if you go back to the mid-60s, we already had similar books claiming that there is a fundamental intrusion into people's lives in which new technology, back then mainframe computers, played a key role or were a driving force. This was more in the context of the emergence of the welfare state. So there are other factors, not only technology at play, to this perceived risk of new technology that threatens our privacy. Now, I would argue, however, as a segue piece, that there is also an alternative reading as we look at the interplay between technology and privacy. And let's take a closer look at this moment in the late 60s, early 70s that were the birth date of modern privacy laws in the US, the time of the mainframe computers. It was actually a combination of technology adoption by the government, buying big computers, and of course the different way that the executive branch started to actually serve its citizens by collecting a lot of data and, you know, keeping dossiers and files and trying to improve its services, in reaction, the first data protection laws came about. The first such comprehensive law, privacy law a la Europe, was the Hesse Act in Germany in 1970, and then, as you know, the Privacy Act here in the US in 1974, followed by many pieces of legislation around the world, actually building up on this moment where you see the adoption of computers as well as changes in how governments particularly serve their citizens and the power imbalances that were perceived. You can even go further back to see that the interplay between technology and privacy law is a little bit more nuanced. 1890, the right to privacy, the famous article by Warren and Brandeis, Harvard Law Review. It was actually another type of technology that triggered this idea of a right to be let alone, and that was actually the digital camera paired with the emergence of the yellow press as a social practice. So yet again, you can argue, well, that technology here is the threat to privacy, but at the same time, it became constitutive for actually a new right that was introduced. And if you look at the language in the article itself, it basically argues, well, in the old times, in the very early times, right, the law only basically protected some sort of physical privacy, but fast forward, gradually the scope of these legal rights broadened, and today it should, this is in 1890, the right to be left alone should be included. So you see that suddenly the interaction becomes more of a co-constitutive relationship as opposed to a one-directional threat. Technology challenges just our privacy. There's more to that story. So I would argue that indeed, if you take a closer look, at least at history, and maybe that teaches us something for the future, we should, or maybe as an alternative, can think about the co-evolutionary model between technology and privacy. If you look, for instance, at the short history, brief history that Daniel Solov provides, a short history of privacy, you see that everything from the telegraph to the introduction of video and all the technologies in between have actually created and pressed the legal system and the society at large to rethink and redefine the scope of privacy rights and frankly expand the notion of privacy and not limit it. So at least from a legal perspective, you see technology paradoxically plays actually a productive role in defining, shaping, and crystallizing privacy rights. Now, if we zoom in a little bit and look at how this has happened, how the legal system actually interacts with new technologies, without being just a stimulus response system, and we're happy to talk more about that, so this story is a bit more complicated, but just isolating for a moment this technology law interplay, you see three dominant response modes by the legal system when confronted with IoT or confronted with augmented reality or back then, you know, telephony or telegram technology. The dominant response mode is that the legal system tries to apply the existing old rules to the new phenomenon. The law does so, the legal system, to apply the old rules to the new thing, because the laws, one of the functions of law is that you want to provide legal certainty and have to, as a legal system, provide some sort of smooth transitions as society evolves. So you try to stabilize by working with the old norms. Now, sometimes that doesn't work very well. you cannot guarantee or solve the tensions that are existing in the society, and you may have to upgrade the legal norms. So you see sometimes these gradual responses. Examples are often when lawmakers are debating whether they want to introduce some sort of amendments to existing laws. So that typically happens over time as courts and lawyers and the legal system and legislators become smarter what type of adjustments need to be made to update laws to, let's say, the digital age, for instance. Same happens, of course, also with privacy. Now, sometimes more radical innovation is required when the law meets new technology. And sometimes these innovations come from courts. The right to be forgotten is such an example where you can argue that was an innovation within the legal system. It didn't come out of the blue. There were some precursors, but it's a pretty significant new thing that the European Court of Justice introduced. And Michel Raymond can tell you all about it. He wrote a wonderful paper about it. Sometimes it's the legislator doing more than just a gradual update, but really creating a new approach. How do we think about things? Raymond will talk more about the European approach to privacy/data protection later this afternoon. But I would argue that the General Data Protection Regulation falls into this category of more general, more fundamental overhaul of a privacy or data protection approach in Europe, where the goal really is to upgrade the law to the paradigm of big data and digital technology that has become so pervasive. Now, what's interesting about that is it's not just a new piece of law that goes further than previous legislation, but it also introduces, or I would say, puts more emphasis on elements that are a little bit more foreign to law initially. And so if you take a closer look at the regulation, privacy by design is a very important element now, where you see that the law starts to embrace technology in a more serious way to address some of the privacy challenges that we heard earlier this morning. So I like this, kind of bake privacy into the design of technical systems. Now, this approach itself, of course, is also not entirely new. It goes back to the 70s and 60s with privacy-enhancing technologies as kind of a precursor of what we see now. But I would argue the General Data Protection Regulation is taking a much more systemic approach how technology and privacy-enhancing techniques and tools should be incorporated in the design of technology. Perhaps more broadly, what we can read into the General Data Protection Regulation is that maybe, here I'm getting a little bit more speculative and coming to the last part, we may be at a point where we move and shift the emphasis from privacy law towards privacy governance, where we use different tools in the regulatory toolbox to address some of these challenges, not only law, but also looking at markets. Think about the big fines that are now bumping up in the GDPR, but also, for instance, organizational measures and professional norms. Think about privacy professionals and privacy technology offices and the like in companies. So what I would argue, and this is, again, the last few slides, maybe we're at a point where we face a paradigm shift, or at least an opportunity to recode and rethink privacy altogether and organize the interplay, particularly between law and technology code or architecture in this LESIG framework, in more interesting ways. And I do believe that the project we've been working on for the past 5 years is an example, or is in that line potentially of argument where we see some of the experiments. Alex has pointed out that some of these kind of more nuanced interactions between the two concern the question how law perceives or deals with or thinks about or frames privacy threats. I think we have a long way to go as lawyers and have a lot to learn from the technical people, from computer science and so forth, how we think about privacy threats and how we can be more precise about it. But Alex and other speakers, Mercedes, have also demonstrated that on the solution side, law can actually be reorganized and become much more productive in its interaction with tools to kind of address some of the challenges and make the relationship between data and privacy much more productive than in the past. I think we're only at the beginning of that, but I feel there is a paradigm shift in the air. Now, the last couple of things. In order to make progress along these lines, and Salil started with that very early on, I think the most important piece is we have to break down silos between the different disciplines. And this project, and one reason I'm so excited about this collaboration, has exactly done that. Salil has also mentioned how much time it has taken us, and even working groups, 5-year-long standing working groups, even to understand each other's terminology between the computer scientists, statisticians, and the lawyers. But that's, I think, exactly the way forward if we want to follow through on the potential of such a paradigm shift that leads us to a more productive interaction between technology and privacy law. I think this is very timely to invest in such collaborations, in strategic ways how we can improve the interfaces among these disciplines that are relevant for privacy, especially as we're entering the world of artificial intelligence as an umbrella term for many different techniques, of course, where a significant strand within AI is now talking about the question, can we build social norms, can we even build legal norms into the systems, into autonomous systems themselves, so that AI starts to watch AI. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the great talk. So for GDPR, what do you see? Well, two questions related to that. First, do you see a possibility that happens in the US, regulation like the one in Europe? And if not, what are the consequences for building the tools? I mean, not only for our project, but even more for any application on every the markets. Of how do we treat that there might be some things that could be accepted here as not as low as high risk sensitive, but it would not be in Europe?
Well, first of all, I'm pessimistic. First of all, it's important, of course, that these response patterns that I showed, they are shaped by the political economy in terms of how they play out. And it's not a coincidence that I think we see much stronger privacy pushes in Europe than in the US. On the other hand side, you know, I feel since Snowden and more recently also looking at what's happening in the corporate space, there is an increased privacy awareness also in the US. I think, however, looking realistically at the political economy, it's very unlikely that we'll see similar legislation as the GDPR in the short run here in the US. Now, the question that I'm wrestling with, and I'm really looking forward to hear from Michelle, I'm not sure actually for the type of work we're doing, whether it's better to have this really holistic legal regime that seems to embrace everything, or it's better to have the patchwork we have here in the US, because the patchwork at least opens up windows for experimentation. And if you look at some of the work we have been doing together, right, as a community, I think we used some of these niches to experiment with kind of new ways how we can reconcile more technical approaches and legal approaches, and we heard a few examples. So that's my answer to your question, right? So, and I can't give the precise answer where we end up, but more experimentation is certainly a good thing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So the last talk for the session is James Honecker talking about Psi, our tool for sharing private data.
Thanks. Thanks for doing here during minute warnings. Can you do a 10? Or can you
Yes.
just turn the 5 into a 10 if that's what it is? Sure. Thanks. Okay, hi. I'm going to talk about Psi. It's named after the ancient Greek emoji of a man doing this. And stands for a private data sharing interface. It's a tool, a system that we've built. We've talked a little bit about how it integrates with other pieces, but a tool for researchers to come to a repository and open up their data to other researchers, provide statistics, statistical summaries of what's in that data to other researchers so that they can discover it, so that they can understand what's in the data, so they can see whether it's applicable to their own research, but preserve the individual level privacy of the participants in that data set. So with mathematical guarantees that we can talk about, be able to make statements that say no individual information can be leaked out of the statistical summaries that I'm willing to release from this data set. And the goal here is that this would allow data sets that ordinarily go into that locked box, that just disappear into the repository, that are archived but nobody gets access to, and really nobody has any understanding of what's even in that data set, to be explored, to be discovered. And then if there is a process for obtaining access to that data through IRBs, through permission also of the original authors, through repository permissions, then that process can begin once you know that the data actually works for you, once you know that data is actually germane to your research. But what we've learned from large projects that have staff that function as an intermediary is that oftentimes maybe only 1 in 10 of those kinds of explorations pan out. The data isn't quite what you thought it was, or it doesn't have enough participants of a particular type in order to do the study that you want, or the variables that you thought were coded in one way turn out to be in a different way, or they're not related in a way that actually makes the data of any use for your larger study. So the goal here, our 3 goals, is to make a system that's accessible for researchers who would come to the repository naturally, okay, and allow them to learn about data sets that are sensitive without having to be experts in mathematical theories or computational theoretical computer scientists, without being experts in privacy, still be able to understand how to interact with this data, be general enough to work for arbitrary data sets that are coming into Dataverse. As Mercedes mentioned, half of them are in the social sciences now, but you see increasingly data sets in the medical sphere or other types of human subject data. And there are applications of differential privacy that are highly tailored and exist out there in industry, with Apple, with Google, with Uber even, that are highly tailored to one specific use case. But our goal here, particularly the large part of the research goal here, is to build something that's general enough that the next data set that comes along that has sensitive information will work in this system. And build something that isn't an entire new detour that a researcher needs to be able to deal with, to learn about, but fits into the natural workflow of the research life cycle. And therefore, integration with Dataverse is a way of just providing a tool that already exists. Providing a tool within the workflow that researchers who are coming to the repository are already using. Okay, why we think this is applicable? Well, three reasons we think differential privacy will make a great tool for data exploration here and discovery of sensitive data sets is, first, differential privacy works well in with certain types of statistical queries, with certain scales of data sets. I'll talk about what differential privacy is informally in just the next slide. But the ways that it masks error, the ways that it masks sensitive information by introducing error, that error decreases often faster than the sampling error of the data set itself. So you will eventually, with large enough data sets or with certain types of statistics, get back answers that are very, very close to what the true sample answer is. We need to worry in the repository setting that as things become increasingly open, that we don't know who the next person coming to the repository is, so we worry more about aggressive actions on sensitive information. And while it's easy to interpret this as, oh, you're using differential privacy to lock away information, really these are data sets that ordinarily in the repository would be completely locked away. So this is not a hindrance. We are opening up information that ordinarily there would be no access to. This is a plus, not a minus for the research community. Okay, so here is differential privacy as we've seen as part of this system level flow, that when you've gone through data tags and you have a sensitive data set, one way you might make some of that information available to the outside public for discovery is by using this tool to generate green level open access public statistics. Let me explain what the mathematical tool that's being used here of differential privacy is. Imagine that we have some analysts who are coming to the repository and they'd like to know some things about this data set. Does this data work for my research? Is this data that would be important to me? Should I go through an IRB to get this? And they can ask questions, but they can't see the raw data. They can only ask questions of an intermediary. And sometimes in real life, we have physical staff intermediaries that are incredibly expensive to maintain, but large projects sometimes have these people. And somebody will say, are there enough subjects of this particular type in order that I might be able to run the regression that I want? Or could you run this very, very simple version of my regression so I can get a result that I can report to the granting agency so they'll give me money so that I can pay you to actually get access to the real data? So we're going to automate all that resource intensive interaction by means of a statistical software tool that's using differential privacy. That thing has access to the real data, and if a question is asked of the data, it can compute the answer to that question, but it's going to answer not exactly correctly. It's going to answer with some noise. It's going to lie ever so discreetly, and it's going to add noise just sufficient to mask the contribution that any one individual could have made to that answer. Okay, so if we imagine that instead of a nice vanilla unthreatening data scientist with research credentials, we've got some adversary who's coming now and asking very, very clever questions that that seem vanilla, but if you tease them apart, could actually reveal information. Let's say they ask for a regression that looks like it's on thousands and thousands of people, so what's the information there? But then they ask for the same regression on a slightly different population, say it's got one extra person in it, and then they difference the two regression results, which look completely releasable. And then what they have is the individual level information of that one person who was not in the first regression, was in the second. Okay? So an adversary is trying to do a re-identification attack through the curator like this. Well, the curator is going to add enough noise so that we can't learn anything about any one individual in the data set. So if this particular respondent was not in the data set, then the distribution of answers from those same queries, differential privacy would guarantee that the distribution would look the same. Okay, so if somebody was in the data set or not in the data set, it would be indistinguishable from the answers that you're receiving, and the curator can't learn anything about that person or even whether they're in the data set. Also, it would be indistinguishable if we changed all their values. Okay, so any one individual in the data set, there's noise sufficient to mask their contribution to any query. Therefore, the distribution of answers looks the same regardless of the contribution of any one individual, and their information is being protected. Okay? All right, so here's our overarching architecture. Thank you. And we have a depositor who has a data set, you know, and for grant and for open science research, open science ethics and norms, they'd like to make their data available. They certainly want to archive it and preserve it in Dataverse. So we've got a data curator here who's storing these files. And they'd like legitimate researchers perhaps to be able to learn about the data or be able to replicate their original findings or go through the IRB process and eventually get access to the data if it's the right data for them, okay? And we're going to use this interface. And this interface is going to help the data depositor describe how they're going to make information available from the repository, and it's going to also help the data analyst understand what's in that data even though they don't get access to the data. Okay, so we've got these three roles here: data owners who are coming to the repository, data curators who are running the repository, data analysts. And we're not expecting differential privacy expertise on any of the parts of these players, modest expertise on the part of the curators, okay? And different trust levels. These people who come to learn these summary statistics might be completely untrusted. If we trust them more, we might give them their own queries that they're allowed to ask in a tiered access model. I'll talk about that in a second. But here's the key things that we've built into this size system that are novel and particularly built towards the idea of having a social science and human subject research open open science-oriented repository. First of all, a large library of exploratory statistics, so you can learn what the variables are in there instead of just their names, understand something about their distribution and whether they reflect what you think they are. Run very, very simple exploratory data analysis regression models, such as linear regressions, probit, logits. Do very simple causal inference. So if you're interested in what's the causal effect of one variable on another, run that model. This is all very novel work to the literature of differential privacy. Also a formal verification engine, and Steve will talk more about this in the future, other strains in this direction, but allow users to make transformations of the variables and then check that those transformations are safe and then allow statistical releases on those transformations. Opens up a wealth of new things that you can explore in a data set if the data set was not configured in the original way that you wanted it to. We deal with missing data, which again is something differential privacy has never dealt with before, and we've got this tiered access model that's also novel. So this is a system of 4 components. If I have a minute after I show the demo, I'll explain some of the components, but I'll show you've heard about Dataverse. We have a library of back-end algorithms written in R that we'll also be releasing, and we have an interface front-end system architecture that I'll be demoing. In the afternoon talk, Vito will be talking about 2 Ravens, which is a way of visualizing the information that is released, which was also something that came out of this project. Let me show the demo. Let me show the general workflow and then the demo. So a depositor comes to the curator. They have a data set they would like to upload to Dataverse. In order to do that, they're going to make some decisions about which statistics they would like to release from that data set, the ones they think are most useful. Those statistics will be created in a differentially private fashion and released to the outside data analyst, who can then explore using this 2 Ravens tool what those differentially private releases look like. And if we trust them enough, we might also allow them to make their own differentially private queries of the data to the data set. Okay, let me show the demo. Perhaps. If I can. Is it washed out? Okay, so a researcher is coming along and they say, I've got this data set. It's actually public data, but it's very much of the style of something that might be private, the public use microsample from the census. And they're filling out the general inverse. They're going into Dataverse. They're declaring what the data set is. They're going to quickly upload it. So here's the standard ingest process in Dataverse. They drag and drop their file in. They've described it a little bit, but they're going to have to restrict it because it's got sensitive information to it. Okay? So they realize that they need to restrict it, and then they're going to upload it. So this is the standard Dataverse upload. Yes, I'll allow people to request access to this data set. Now, let me move the thing. So this, let me see what's going on here. Okay, so they've uploaded the data set, and here's the page. Let me, 1 second here. They're going to, 1 second. At this point here is where they can decide to make differentially private releases from native right into the Dataverse. They're about to publish it. So now the data set has been archived and cataloged on Dataverse. Okay? So now imagine switch gears. Instead of being the depositor, I'm going to be an anonymous user who's now coming to Dataverse, and let's see I'm looking for data about California. What data is out there that could answer some of my queries? And I find this very interesting data set that's just been published just today, perhaps this morning, and I find this data set and it looks interesting. But then when I click on it, I find, okay, look, there's nothing that I can learn about this data. It's locked. I have to request access to it. So that's state of the art as of this point right now. Looks interesting, but there's nothing I can do with this data. So go back to the original researcher. He's uploaded the data. He's realizing nobody has access to it. So now he's going to go into the differentially private tool. Okay? And from Dataverse, we're being moved on to this budgeter. We're going to get a very quick description of what differential privacy is. okay, and how the system is going to work. You will need some information, but we've got these 5 possible use cases. I pick a story that I think lines up with my data set, or possibly I use data tags to generate these numbers for me. But I set 2 privacy parameters, privacy loss parameters from differential privacy. Then I can move forward with my budgeter. And I can say, okay, so these are the variables that are in my model. What would I like to release? What do I think might be useful to an outside researcher to see about this data to understand what's actually going on in this data set? Okay, so I selected some variables. I needed to define their type and provide some metadata about them. From that, I can choose some statistics and release them in a differentially private manner. Okay? The fact that I need to provide this metadata myself, rather than inspecting the data, rather than looking at the data and finding it empirically in the data set, is a further safeguard for privacy. It means that we can't leak information by these numbers being exact. So there's a little bit more work on the case of the depositor, but I'm building up these statistics that I'm going to release. I think I had mean of gender and a couple of statistics on age. I might release marital status, or I might also release I'm not going to release marital status. I'm going to release a multivariate statistic on interactions between a number of different variables here. Gender, marital status, and education was really what I wanted. And as I've been doing this, I've been building up this table on the right-hand side, okay, which are the statistics that I'm going to release and a measure of how much error is going to be introduced on those statistics in order to safeguard privacy. Okay, so here I'm building up a linear regression. I'm going to tell people the result of a regression that predicts, let's see, I'm going to predict
income from education.
That would have been nice. Does that sound like a good idea? I'm going to predict marital status, which might or might not be a plausible variable. Can I predict marital status as a function of gender and education? Yes. Well, the differentially private answer will tell me. So I had these on the right here. I had these errors that were being promised. Epsilon is a technical mathematical term in differential privacy that is determining how much information I'm willing to leak in each one of these statistics, and it's compositional. So the more information I leak on one statistic, the less I'm going to release on another in order to make the same privacy guarantee. Okay? And I don't need to see epsilon. I'm just showing this for people who are in the literature. I can tune this entirely by these promises of error. Okay? So I can decide exactly how much error I think might be reasonable or still give me a useful statistic by tuning that on that page right there. There was this, I'm going to back up just 20 seconds because I can't quite talk as fast as I imagined. So I'm saying, okay, I'm willing to release a little bit more error on this gender variable because spending so much of my privacy budget on that one variable was giving me less error than I needed, and therefore the other variables are going to have a little less noise. There's lots of other features that I can adjust. I can change those epsilons if I realize I made a mistake, if I go back. If I realize that this data is actually a secret sample from a much larger data set, which PUMS actually is, then these epsilons would have functionally much larger values, and I was just demonstrating that briefly before getting rid of that. I can reserve some of the epsilon for future queries for other people to come along. That is, some of the information I'm willing to leak, I might say that's for research. I don't know what researchers need to see in the future. These errors themselves are directly interpretable as sentences about that statistic. So every single statistic that has an error has a question mark next to it, and it says, okay, I will tell you exactly in the space of that statistic what that error means. There is a built-in a guide to all the pieces of this interface and to differential privacy. Here's dealing with missing values as a feature here, which is necessary in any pragmatic implementation for human subject data. There's going to be missing data, and the literature hasn't dealt with that in the past. Okay, and so finally I'm going to say I like the way I've built these statistics. I'm going to make the release. It's going to be final. That was the warning. When I finally make that release, okay, this is a metadata file that contains all of that information. It's now been written. It's now been released once. No going back. It's being stored in Dataverse. Okay? And when I go back to be this anonymous user and re-click on this, re-click on that page there, here's my anonymous user. Now they have the ability to explore the, do it one more time, now they have the ability to explore the differentially private releases or to download this differentially private metadata file native into Dataverse. Okay? Thanks. Any questions about that? I'll just say I'll anticipate one question, which is that I've been told that IQSS and some of the collaborators that I work with and build very, very nice tools that can be intriguing to use and then difficult to use in practice. And so I will just mention, if I can find this. That we did a very thorough three-tier usability study. And I don't seem to know how to get back to presentation mode. Right here. Sorry. 28 subjects, and we learned a lot from actually having people who knew nothing about differential privacy use this analysis. We ran 28 subjects over 3 phases. They had 11 tasks to do in this. And then in addition to getting lots of user input about what worked, what didn't, what they understood, where they were making errors when we were watching what they were doing and listening to what they were saying, which we had them vocalize. We also used the standard SUS score, which is a scale of how easy is a system to use, self-reported from the users themselves. And we had a mean score of the high 70s, which sounds like a C+, but it's not really pegged on that scale. I'd say that our score there scores much higher than Excel. So it's an easier system to use than Excel, which is something that researchers are commonly need to use. Better than usability studies on GPS software, and slightly worse than an iPhone. Okay, so the system to use is not as easy to use as your iPhone, but easier to use than your GPS. And we think that that is an example of accessibility. And that's where I'll leave things. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. It'd be great if discussion and questions continue, but let's do that in the coffee break, which we have now. We'll be back in here at 11:10 for the next session, so about a little over 20 minutes. Thank you.
Hey everybody, thanks for having me here. I'm Sam Madden. I'm going to talk about some work we've been doing as a part of this NSF Big Data Hub. We're one of the spoke grants that's there. This is a little bit of some unusual research for me, actually. My background is in building systems for processing data, and we got interested in this problem of data sharing, and I think I wanted to come here and talk today because I think what we're doing is sort of well aligned with what a lot of people in this room are thinking about, and I feel like we're just down the street, and it's a shame we don't talk more. So I guess all that's to say, if you see stuff that inspires you here, please shoot me an email. I'd love to talk to you more and connect with folks here. So I think the problem we're interested in is a problem that is familiar to all of you. Data sharing is clearly really important and something that needs to happen. A lot of the promise of quote unquote big data or whatever it is based on our ability to share data. If we could only get all this information that's locked up inside of organizations everywhere and put it together, think of all the cool things we could do: solve world hunger, fix the environment, solve medicine, cure cancer, make our policing better, or whatever it is, right? There are a million of these applications that are out there, and I think it's unclear how many of these will truly be solved by data sharing, but it's clear that in order to even start to understand these questions, there are a lot of hurdles that we have to get over, and that's kind of what we're inspired by in this research. Like, how do we make it so that it's easier for people to share data with each other? In particular, how do we make it for people who have data sets that are valuable, that they want to share? How do we make it as painless as possible for them to actually share their data with other people? Where we're focused on really sharing data where it's not, an open kind of a licensing model is not appropriate. I mean, this is settings like, if you're a medical researcher, you have some data set. You can't just put this data set out there in the open and let people have access to it. There has to be some kind of an agreement that dictates who can use it and what they can use it for. Okay, so again, this is preaching to the choir in this room. You guys all know that data sharing is hard, okay? It's not easy to do this. You might think open data is a solution. I think for some data sets, open data is in fact a solution. Some of the government data things that we're seeing, like the folks in New York City and even in Boston, have done a really great job of opening up data and making it available. But there's a lot of data that's locked up in the world where frankly, it's it would be great if it was open, but we're just not gonna. We're not going to get to a point anytime soon where, because of HIPAA and other things in medicine, for example, we're going to be able just to, put data out there. And a lot of companies have their own data sets where they're just, they have this, they view this as their proprietary data. They're not going to give it away to the world. They might give it to a researcher who they think can help them get some value out of it. But they're not just going to simply, share it. So, you have to go beyond this kind of Creative Commons putting data out there. You have to, figure out how to, create incentives to share data. You have to get past some of these barriers that prevent people from being able to share data. You have to help these companies kind of mitigate these concerns around sensitive information. Frankly, a lot of people are very, when they look at HIPAA and the fact that they could be, potentially prosecuted if data gets leaked, that makes people very, very uncomfortable. There's a lot of medical researchers in the Boston area, for example, who would love to collaborate with smart computer scientists to help solve their medicine problems, but they're super afraid of this, like, well, what if, this patient-sensitive data leaks? So, and then finally, one of the things that really kind of inspired us in this research when I talk a little bit about the platform we're building is that it's not enough to just view this as, throwing data over the wall. Like, a lot of times you go to all this effort to negotiate a data use agreement with somebody, and then you get it arrives as a Dropbox link to an encrypted file or as a hard disk, right? And that's what I would characterize as throwing data over the wall. There's no ability for any insight that happens on top of that data to be easily transferred back to the original data owner, because you've created a separate copy of the data that is completely independent of the original copy of the data. So wouldn't it also be great if when data sharing happens, it actually happens in a platform that makes it possible to really truly collaborate on data. So again, I know I'm speaking to the choir here, but the state of the art of data sharing today is if you go to a company or a medical researcher and say, boy, you've got this data set I would really like to get access to, even if you have the best intentioned collaborator on the other side of the aisle at this organization, me as an academic, I have to negotiate with both lawyers at MIT and lawyers at that company in order to get access to the data, okay? And these data sharing agreements create a barrier to actually getting access to data. So what we're trying to do in this data sharing spoke very concretely is to, first of all, make it so that for sort of 80% of the data sharing use cases, these data sharing agreements are like, click a set of checkboxes. And I know there's some of you in the room who have sort of a similar inspiration. Like, how do we make it so that these data sharing agreements are not bespoke agreements that are negotiated, one-off with every time there's a company, and it takes, people talk about, I think, honestly talk about it takes 6 months to a year from the time of you want to share the data to actually sharing the data. I personally have had, I had a major internet company come to me and say, we would love to share some data with you to collaborate with you. We spent probably a year, not sustained, but like meeting say once a month meeting with lawyers, and the end of it they said, you know what, this is too complicated, we can't do this. I think that's not an uncommon experience for people to have. So how do we make it so that when these things happen, it's possible to just generate these licenses in a very, in a way that both sides can sort of understand. The licenses are formed in a way that everybody can agree on the terms, and where there's just a much lower sort of barrier to actually creating the licenses. And then once you have these kind of drag and drop or choose from a menu of options licenses, can you build a data sharing platform that actually enforces those licenses? And so that's where the sort of computer science research part of this that I'm more involved in comes along. So our goal is to have some set of standard licensing terms, checkboxes like, oh, it has to have controlled access, and here's who can have access, or tracking of access, auditing, a set of usage rights about who can publish the data, whether you can publish the data, some duration of use kinds of agreements, some warranties about the completeness of the data. Maybe there are other requirements or regulations you have to comply with. So there's a set of kinds of things that might be covered. And the idea is somebody can sort of check off in their license which ones of these apply. So the way we started to sort of tackle this problem is to first of all understand what are all the things that appear in licenses. So we went off and we just collected about 30 or 40 of these agreements, focusing on academics who want to share data with companies. So we collected from a bunch of different universities these kinds of data sets, and we just started cataloging what's happening in these agreements. So there's my collaborator Jane Greenberg at Drexel has been sort of leading this initiative, and her graduate students have gone through and taken these data sets, done a bunch of the sort of simple content analysis on them, and sort of organizing them into a set of metadata that tells you what are the things that you can generally expect to find in these agreements. And the things are what we all knew was there, but it's super useful to have them sort of categorized into groups of terms, like the high-level categories around what are the what are the privacy and protection regulations in the data, who has access to the data, who's responsible for protecting the data, who owns the data, what rights do you have to relicense the data, to publish the data, what kind of compliance regulations are there, specifics about where the data has to be stored or how long it can be stored for. So they've done a really nice job of going through these things and laying out the different categories that appear in all these different types of agreements. And for each one of these subcategories, like privacy and protection, they've created this kind of menu of all the things that you can expect to see in terms of in these different things. And they've done a nice job of doing stuff like analyzing what are the kinds of terms. So this is just sort of a heat map style visualization of the most common terms that apply in these things. The sorts of things you expect, like privacy and protection, are words that appear all the time. Other words appear, still with some frequency, like law, standard, so on and so forth. Okay, so taking these licenses and understanding something about what the types of terms are in these licenses, now what we want to do is, say, okay, we're going to have some, tool which allows users to quickly configure what sorts of protections should apply to their data, automatically generate these licenses, and then we want this platform, which we're calling ShareDB, to be able to automatically enforce the terms of these licenses. And so this ShareDB platform is actually built on a hosted data repository that we built at MIT called DataHub. It's similar in spirit in a lot of ways to Dataverse. I think if you can sort of think of this as like we're trying to build this privacy layer on top of something, or this data sharing layer on top of a tool like Dataverse. And I'll talk a little bit about the features of this thing. And you'll see that a lot of what we end up being focused on is really how do we deal with these privacy preservation kinds of issues, which is why I wanted to come and talk at this workshop. So the kind of at a very high level, the model is some data owner has some data set, they want to share it with some collection of users, and what those users need is some suitably aggregated, de-identified, fingerprinted data set that they can operate on. So instead of having access to the, original unsanitized data, they need a view of this data, which is, protected in some way. And our philosophy with the ShareDB platform, as I mentioned at the beginning, is that these are not separate copies of the data set, but they are views of the original data set in the sort of, if you know what a view is in a database, a sense of it. It's like this is this is when you're operating on top of this data set, which you're actually, the ShareDB platform is actually taking the original data set and, giving you a view of that data, which is anonymized. But any operation that you apply on this anonymized data set, in theory could come and run back on the original data set as well. So it's not a separate copy. It's the same data that just has this sort of translation layer that hides all of the sensitive information from you when you act upon it. Okay, and of course, the idea is there'll be an access log and an audit log, and there's features to allow you to control who has access and how long they have access for, and have different classes of access privileges and so on and so forth. So the data owner gets to decide how the data is protected and who has access to it, gets access to a log of who has access to it, and they publish the data through the ShareDB platform. Okay, so the natural question is like, okay, how much of this is actually automatable? Of course, there are things that appear in these licensing agreements that you're never going to be able to automate through some piece of software, right? Like, you're probably not going to be able to, you might eventually be able to go in somebody's publication and enforce the fact that in their publication they did or did not, use some particular data set or mention some particular data set. That sounds like it's going to be hard to build a technical tool to enforce. But there are lots of things that appear in these agreements that you can, I think reasonably expect a piece of technology to be able to apply and enforce. So, for example, obviously access control and rights management is like, these agreement clauses have these things about controlled access and duration of use. And it's really straightforward if you have a shared data platform to just, say this is only accessible to these user IDs for this duration of time, right? So it's kind of obvious that you're going to be able to build some technology that can, handle these things. The same is largely true of log editing auditing. I mean, it's pretty straightforward to build a software tool that can keep track of who accessed it and what they did. Other things maybe are a little bit, trickier to figure out. Like if you can you, for example, fingerprint the views of this data so that if somebody copies the data and sends it to somebody else, you can figure out that this was a copy of the data. Like, how feasible is that, and under what circumstances is it really feasible? But I think there's some reason to believe, and there's been some research that has shown that these kinds of fingerprinting things can be done. And then, of course, all the things that people in this room worry about, these privacy-preserving mechanisms around noising, around differential privacy, are things that these platforms really can do. I mean, as the talk we just heard demonstrated, I think there's a lot of optimism and a lot of reason to believe, and a lot of people who are really I think doing good work at pushing the boundaries of these techniques like differential privacy to a point where they actually can be used by non-experts, and we're trying to incorporate some of that in the work that we do as well. So just to give you some quick sort of click-through screenshots about what we've built, this isn't this is sort of we're in process of getting this thing released into our Data Hub platform, but hopefully within a few months, this is something you guys can download and play with. I don't know if these screenshots are legible. It might be a little bit small, but where are the lights?
The second panel from the right.
Second.
The bottom button, I think.
This one? Oh, just off. Oh, that. All right, you guys can all take a nap. Sorry, it's a little bit small, but the idea is you can create a new license. So you go into this tool as a data publisher. I can create a license which is a way of saying here are the terms that apply to my thing, and this can include both sort of pre-configured regulations like I need HIPAA or FERPA compliance for this thing, or specific kinds of mechanisms like I need to anonymize or remove PII from this data set. Okay. Then you give a name to this license, and then you can take this license and you can pick a particular collection of tables that you can then take this license and you can apply it to a particular data set. So a data set is just in our system just a collection of tables. This is again I think it's tables or files, and you can then apply a license to a particular collection of data, tables or files. And when you apply that license, essentially what you get to do is you just choose that license and say, I want to apply it to these particular tables. And then based on the license, what the tool asks you to do is go in and configure go into each one of the tables, like some base table here, and configure what the private information is that needs to be removed. So for example, you can simply go in and say, I want to hide these columns columns. That would be the simplest kind of thing you can do. But you can go in and do other things like, say I want to aggregate these columns using, differential privacy, or I want to aggregate these columns using k-anonymity, or I want to replace this column with a hash of its value. So you can pick some very simple standard transformations as a data owner about how you want to publish the data and release it to, a set of collaborators. So the tool then allows you to add a set of collaborators to every data set. Just, basically say these are the people who can, for example, read this data or modify this data. And then those collaborators have access to the data through this Data Hub platform. And what Data Hub looks like is a tool for some sort of built-in tools for visualizing and browsing the data, as well as a SQL interface for running queries directly on top of the data. So you get this anonymized view that you can directly interact with and query in your system. Okay, so sorry that the screenshots are so hard to read, but I'm just going to talk quickly about a couple of things that we've done in the sort of privacy space and that we're working on. One thing we've done is to build tools that automatically de-identify. So we've been trying to build tools that detect sensitive columns. I say these look like names, these look like social security numbers. So by using simple machine learning classifiers or rules to understand what information is and then strip it out. So this is so that you don't have to do this yourself. It sort of automatically finds the sensitive information. Again, in this sort of a setting, the user, uploads this data set, the tool would automatically identify some of the columns as being, sensitive, like, either PII under the HIPAA definition of PII, or, columns that the data types that the user has explicitly said they want to be, protective of, like age or gender information or other things like that. And then the tool will automatically identify them and flag them. So that's one thing we built. A couple of other things were built. We've added support for k-anonymous views. We're working on support for differentially private views, where we're focusing really on histogram-based views, employing different kinds of differential privacy mechanisms. We've been talking a little bit to Ashwin Makanavajala at Duke about integrating some of his ideas around applying the best differentially private mechanism to a data set based on the distributions of the data. And sort of our key, one of the key things that we think is interesting here is to say, can the user give us a target error rate, not a target epsilon, and can we pick the best scheme for that target error rate? And try to actually reach a target error rate that the user wants. So I think again that's clearly very closely aligned with the talk we just heard, and it'd be fun for us all to get together and collaborate, I think, on this. So that's kind of where we are. I hope you'll check out our tool. We're going to have another workshop on the work we're doing here in 2018. We're still looking for more license agreements. We're looking at adding a bunch of different technologies into our platform, watermarking, auditing, more time-based fine-grained access control, and more support for metadata. I'd love to talk to you guys about any of these things. As I said, we're down the street, and I think clearly we're a lot of synergistic things happening here. So I'm happy to be here. Thanks for taking the time, and I think I am 10 seconds over. So, all right. Does the next speaker want to get set up? I'm happy to take a couple questions. Yeah.
Use the letters DB. Is the data actually in a database, like a MySQL?
In our, yes, technically at the back end of this thing, the data is sitting in some Postgres database, although we try hard to hide it.
Yeah. And presumably the views are Postgres views.
Yeah, although some of these things can't be done directly as Postgres views because it's not clear that that Postgres user-defined functions are capable of actually expressing all of these kinds of anonymization you might want to do. So yeah, a Postgres view can trivially do the hide this column thing, but can a Postgres view do this, create a differentially private histogram of this data? It's not totally clear. So some of these things actually get implemented as a layer on top of Postgres in our application.
Just one question about the way you did all of the process to create the formalization. And in my opinion, I think it's the first time I've seen a convincing way of doing a sort of smart contract finally. So have you thought about getting into that space and giving guidance on folks who are trying to do the same thing?
We were talking just a little bit over the break about about what is the relationship between smart contracts and what we're trying to do here. And I think clearly this is we have not worked in smart contracts at all. And I'll say we just came to this because this was a pain point that we had, and we said, how would we solve this pain point as like applied computer scientists without any predisposition about what work had been done. And then we went out and we started talking to people like you guys in this room. We realized there's a lot of you who are thinking about very similar problems, and that's why we're here. If I'd love if you think our approach is useful, I would love to talk to you about it. All right, I'm out of time. Thanks, guys.
How about you speak about student data?
So my co-speaker, Carson, is going to be here today, but we both work for the Harvard Vice Provost for Advanced Learning, which is a data science research group on campus. And today I'll be talking about the data pipeline that handles the billions of...
Maybe it's off.
There we go. Okay. All right. Let me just start all over. So we work for a research group, Dustin and I, called the Vice Provost for Advanced Learning, which is a research group on campus. And we are a data science team that supports research on both the Canvas and edX platforms. Today I'll be talking about the Canvas data pipeline and privacy considerations. And basically the question we're trying to answer is, how do you handle all the billions of events that are logged every day, I think since 2014 for the Canvas learning management system? And how do you allow pedagogical questions to be answered of this data while also considering the privacy of students and faculty? And so the challenges that we have, so building this system is not easy. We developed a data pipeline, but before I get into that, I'll discuss some of the challenges. So Harvard is basically a very decentralized place. They like to use different tools. So the primary learning management system that all the schools use is Canvas. But not only that, there's the ability to kind of plug in external tools. So we have a bunch of other platforms that plug into Canvas, namely video management systems. So we have things like MediaSites and Matterhorn, which are their own separate video management systems that also record data. We also have a bunch of other external tools that called LTI that can plug into Canvas. But to take Canvas as a primary example, there are also different ways that you can access data. So I don't know if people have used the REST API through Canvas at the course level, where you can grab data from the Canvas platform if you have proper tokens. The data that we get, VPAL Research, is the entire data set daily, which provides data on all the different features and tables. So there's like over 1,000 variables in the Canvas platform, hundreds of tables. So we get that daily. And so the question is, how do you process all that data? The biggest of that data set is the request logs. And that data is very messy, and we get, those are the billions of events that we get, that we have in our system. And so not only that, but you also need to handle security. So all the data is level 3. And so, and then you have a bunch of other stakeholders, where a stakeholder is basically anyone that wants to ask data, the question from the data. And so those could be faculty, administrators, researchers, IT, course teams, et cetera, et cetera. And so these are the challenges which are inherent in any big data problem set. And so not only that, but we also need to handle scalability. So this kind of illustrates the different dimensions in which the system can scale. And so you can have here on the left, which I mentioned are the data sources, which these are the 3 main big hitters that we have in our data set. But not only that, when you add the stakeholders, those stakeholders can grow. And each of those stakeholders can ask multiple questions and have multiple requests and want the data at different frequencies, Some may want it daily. A researcher may just want the snapshot of the data. Or if you have like an app, you would probably want to give that like a daily refresh of the data so that the app can show the latest data from the current day. And so not only that, but you have differing levels of skill sets for the people that use the data. So people may not be experienced with programming or learning how to use Python or R. And so there are different ways that people can consume the data. And so we also have to think about supporting that on the right side. So I have here dashboards, which people can use without having to know anything. You can also just export CSV files and have the researcher do their analysis on that. So to summarize, we have a bunch of questions for our data infrastructure. So these are kind of the questions that we've asked ourselves when designing the data pipeline. So basically, how do we generalize data pipelines for different data sources that are disparate? How do we generalize approaches to processing data across different stakeholders? And how do you support a growing number of stakeholders who want access to the data? The last two bullets deal with security. For those that are given access to the data, how do you protect the identities of students and other sensitive information that shouldn't be used for research? And additionally, we also have to have the flexibility of revealing identities in the event that there is an approved use case. For example, faculty dashboards where people want to know, which students have viewed their videos, for example. Here are some questions for privacy and sensitive data. So we kind of have them lumped into two categories. So sensitive data or any variables that could be directly or with some degree of work be used to identify students. So obvious one would be name. But there are also other data that we need to think about excluding, such as emails. So there are emails on the Canvas platform that you can email other students. So that data shouldn't be used for research at all. So are these variables, should these variables be loaded at all in our database? And if so, should they just be purged upon coming into the system? And so these are kind of the questions that we had when designing the pipeline. And so we have here the generic data pipeline. So what we've done is taken the cloud approach. So we heavily use Amazon, but we've also built our own in-house software to deal with a lot of the requirements for our system. And so a lot of the technologies we use are Hadoop, Hive, Redshift, S3. But we basically built this on top of an infrastructure that allows the ability to process, de-identify, and analyze the Canvas data and all the other data sources that we use, namely the video management platform systems. And so to dig a little deeper, I can point out here at the top here, Bootstrap Lambda is kind of a, I believe it's an Amazon offering where we're able to kind of generalize the data, the data sources. So we have separate lambdas for each data source. So one for Canvas, one for media sites, one for Matterhorn. That all gets loaded, that all gets fed into this data pipeline. We have a code generator step, which basically takes, it's a schema file from the data provider. So for Canvas, we actually get a schema file in JSON that defines all the tables and variables. So we use that to automatically generate code, which then processes all the data into our data pipeline. So we've basically made our data pipeline kind of data agnostic, data source agnostic, and so that we can basically add data sources by just modifying a JSON file and having the code generator spit out custom pipeline code for each of these data sources. I'll talk more about the identity step later, which is the most important part of the pipeline, which basically links all the users together across all data sets. But the final step is basically loading the data into Redshift, which allows us to process all the log data And then we have this step called the Rapid Research Framework, which is basically, it's a Python and SQL framework, which allows us to rapidly prototype different data products based on the stakeholder needs. So we can customize a lot of the requests, but then use a common code base to answer those questions. And so I mentioned the identity management step. This step is one of the, probably the most important step. It links all the users together across all platforms. And so we do that using a Hadoop process. It runs on a Elastic MapReduce machine on Amazon, which we use daily. And what it does is every day we get a new data dump. We ingest the data and we check for every table for the user ID and produce a mapping from that data set's main identifier to all known identifiers for that user. So we basically kind of group all the data, all the personally identifiable data variables for all the tables in Canvas, and we actually remove all that data and put them in an identity mapping table, so that when you look at the database, they'll be in Redshift in this identity mapping table. So here's an example of all the 3 or 4 data sets that we currently ingest. So we use Canvas, Matterhorn, Metasites, and SIS. All the users are recorded differently in each of those data sources. So on Canvas, there's a Canvas user ID and name. On Matterhorn, HUID is used. Metasites, email is used. In the SIS data, HUID is used. So that goes all into a user identity map Hadoop job, which then processes the data, assigns a user ID if that user doesn't exist. So it's a random 128-bit 32-character string ID that's basically meaningless, but it assigns it so that it's universally unique for that user and puts them in a row in this table. And the output of this is basically the same data, but with all the personally identifiable, all the personal identifiers removed and replaced with this user research ID. So this is the de-identified student LMS dataset in Redshift. I have an asterisk here because it's not 100% de-identified. It just takes the user IDs and kind of replaces them, but that's just to make it harder for people to find out the identity of a student, but that doesn't mean that they can do other things to find out the identity of that student. So that's why it's not 100% de-identified. And so this is an example of what happens. So up here, you can kind of see in Canvas, you have the Canvas ID with this number. In Matterhorn, it's recorded as their HUID, Metasites, it's their email. This is all the same user interacting with Canvas, Matterhorn, and Metasites through the Canvas front end. After it goes through our Hadoop process, our data pipeline, they just get replaced with their research ID, which is this here, which is consistent and persistent across all tables within Canvas, Matterhorn, and Metasites. And we also have this identity mapping table, which will basically tell you if you do need the identities of the students, you can get their names, emails, or Canvas ID. And the next part is we have this rapid research framework, which comes after the ETL pipeline. So what this does is allow us the flexibility to customize data requests and use them to ask questions of the data once it's in the database. And we can either provide de-identified data or identified data based on the data request. And once that's satisfied, we can deliver the data to the stakeholders. And we have a a standardized process. So this is assuming that the researcher or requester has went through the proper IRB processes. They've signed a DOA agreement. So there's usually like a principal investigator in the data request. And so that, that user, our principal investigator, will be delivered the data through this method. And this method will be kind of a two-level process where we first give them the credentials to an Amazon bucket, which will have access key and secret key, so only they can access that. But not only that, we also encrypt the data at each data product level and zip that up with the public key of the principal investigator. And so they should once they download the data, they can decrypt the data with their private key on their laptop. But they'll be responsible for basically anyone that's listed on the IRB and managing the data access. So they'll understand the consequences if they don't handle the data properly. So this is our secure method of delivering the data to the stakeholders currently. And so just to tie it all together, this is an example of 2 use cases. Just wanted to emphasize the ability to provide de-identified data sets. So that's this on the left side. So the rapid research is basically a 3-step process. So you have a question about maybe something that doesn't require student names. I'll go down this way. So you have the analysis of product interfaces. So what VPAL research does is basically map the user's requests to our current knowledge of transformations, which we call data products, at the different dimensions. So we have course listings, course enrollments, files, assignments, course videos. Once it's in this level, it's basically all the data merged into that, that dimension there. And once we get the proper variables and data products that satisfy the question, the last step is basically delivering the data through the S3 method and encrypting the data with the key of the public key of the requester. Likewise, we can also provide identifiable data sets. And so these are actually JSON files that I can run through the rapid research framework, and I just add one line that says HUID or name. And it can do the same query but extract the HUID from the identity table and put them into a CSV file that's available to the requester. And that will be encrypted the same way that is with the de-identified data set. And so they end up being CSV files, which can be used for research or even apps or whatever use case was approved. And I think that's the last slide I have. Yep. Sure.
We have time for questions too.
So you mentioned that the de-identification that you do doesn't mean that the students can't be re-identified. Is that a worry for you all in any of the kinds of queries? Like what are the worst case scenarios that you worry about and wish that you might have better methods to deal with?
So we're actually are working, Jim Waldo, from his faculty from SAS, he's working on that method to kind of provide a better identification. So we actually have in our IRB approval process, we have, I think, a line in there that says which type of de-identification that they need. And so right now, the one that we have now for Canvas is, I think it's a level 2, I believe. But we are thinking of ways to incorporate, once that research is done, to completely de-identify the data, to the ability to add that in our data pipeline process now. But that is not to say that, so that is definitely a concern for us that we're aware of, and we want to build that as the research gets better. Because we've had that, I think we've provided on the annex side, a de-identified data set. So we have methods to do it, but we're working on better methods to make it even more foolproof. But that is to say that it would be really hard for someone to kind of, get all the different information and kind of, you would need a lot of access and stuff to fully do it. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
Another question? Again. So our next speaker is going to be John Abbott from the US Census, and he will tell us about how the census is going to use differential privacy in the next decennial census.
Thank you. Well, so I'm really delighted to be here, and I entertained doing this presentation without slides, but I actually did have a set of approved slides, so I'm going to use them as a little bit of a crutch. I am required to show you the bottom line here, which reminds you that these are my views and not the views of the Census Bureau. But the top slide is the one that should get your attention. This is the technical team working on implementing the differential privacy protection for the 2020 census of population. And there are a number of very familiar names on that, I think. Dan Kiefer, Ashwin Machanabahala, Michael Hay, Jerome Miklau, people that I've worked with in the past on projects like this. There are some people in this room, so I'm going to call them out, Kobe and Cynthia and Adam and Sophia that I've worked with as well. To be frank, I tried to corner the market on specialists in implementing differential privacy. The slight constraint was that they had to be American citizens, so I have a very clever contract covering Ashwin Machanabahala, who is not. All right. You don't need to see my outline. In this room, I do not have to state the database reconstruction theorem. I certainly don't have to prove it. I can point here if we need a proof. The disclosure avoidance systems that the Census Bureau and every other statistical agency in the world have in place, present tense, do not protect against a reconstruction attack. And it is extremely important for statistical agencies to acknowledge that. It doesn't mean that we have a solution for every data product, but it means that you can't deny mathematics. So with the help of some of the people in this room, we have been conducting research on reconstruction attacks. That's all I'm allowed to say. Thank you, Cynthia, for being such a vocal person reminding those of us in this community that we needed to take this seriously. I don't think you need to worry about that anymore. So the end-to-end census test used to be called address rehearsal. You've probably read a lot about it in the press because the IT systems, especially the one that supports the internet self-response component, are somewhat behind schedule, although they're catching up very rapidly. I will say that Secretary Ross and Undersecretary Kelly have been extremely supportive. And in fact, Undersecretary Kelly has been briefed on what I'm going to tell you about today and was extremely supportive. So normally, though, if a system passes the test during the address rehearsal or the end-to-end test, then it's incorporated into the 2020 census. And so differential privacy is the default protection mechanism for the 2020 census because it is the production mechanism for the 18 end-to-end test. This is the flagship program of the largest statistical agency in the United States and one of the most influential statistical agencies in the world, and this is a big deal. I announced it publicly on slides that do not have that qualifier, that these are my opinion, at the Census Scientific Advisory Committee on September 14th and 15th. It's on the second day, September 15th. There was a really lively discussion because there are a lot of very high-powered users on that advisory committee, including the chair, Barbara Anderson from the University of Michigan. And as the scales fell off their eyes, it became quite clear that the American Community Survey, the economic census that's conducted in this year with reference to 2017, and many of our other flagship products are going to have their disclosure avoidance systems modernized as well. But we're starting with the census of population. The reason we started with the census of population is that the person-level data at the census of population was, at least as far as I understand it, one of the defining examples for the original differential privacy paper. The authors, 3 out of 4, are in the room, and if they wish to contradict that during the discussion, they're free to. And even if it wasn't, it should have been, but I'm pretty sure it was. If you can't engineer the most researched, formally private system into the data that it was designed to help us think about how to protect, then we'd really have to go back to the drawing board. I think we have successfully engineered a differential privacy protection system. I'm going to talk a bit about not so much the technical details of that. I'm not allowed to talk about too many of them yet. I will say, as we said publicly, that for the end-to-end test, every single bit of code and the algorithms and the parameter values will be released along with the test publications. We need your help. We're not going to get it by keeping the algorithms and the code and the parameter values secret. More importantly, and this I will spend a lot of time on, the decisions about how to allocate epsilon, the privacy loss budget, are not being made by the engineers. They're not being made by me. They're not being made by Dan Kiefer or Simpson Garfinkel. They are being made by the highest policy-making board inside the Census Bureau, the Data Stewardship Executive Policy Committee, because the statute enabling the taking and the publication of the census entrusted to the Census Bureau that decision-making. Not necessarily because that's socially optimal, but that is the way it is, and that's how we're going to have to conduct this census. That has been the biggest culture change, how to understand that an information loss budget, a privacy loss budget, binds the entire agency. It's been a major educational process, and that educational process continues. So, a little bit of economics. I'm an economist by training, for those of you who think that I'm not, who didn't know me before I put my census hat on. The information in a confidential database is a finite resource. It's so obvious in economics that I can't even get the publication, the paper that discusses this in technical economics terms, taken seriously by most economics referees. It's all, quote, obvious, close quote. Well, it isn't all that obvious, to be frank. And the competing uses for that confidential database are accuracy. Are the data fit for the use that they are intended to be put to? Traded off against the loss of privacy associated with making them better fit for that use. And I'm going to show you the paradigm use case from the census of population by the end of this talk. Right. Those competing uses directly state the dual mandate that a statistical agency like the Census Bureau has. Mandate 1 is to publish data that are suitable for the use that they are statutorily mandated for. Mandate 2 is to protect the confidentiality of the respondents that supplied those data. It should be clear that those are competing uses of the same resource, but the economics helps. The economics helps because it distinguishes what the computer scientists do, the marginal rate of transformation, the opportunity cost associated with increasing accuracy at the cost of some privacy loss, versus the social choice, which is the public's willingness to pay for more accurate data in terms of foregone privacy loss, not in terms of foregone budget dollars. The budget is held constant here. Both the accuracy of the published data and the privacy protections associated with differential privacy are public goods. That, to an economist, that basically says you cannot rely on a market solution to this problem. Maybe you can find one if you're extraordinarily clever, or if you're Ronald Coase, you can assume one exists, and then state that the conditions under which it would exist are incredibly hard to reproduce, just to be fair to him. I'm not just an economist, I'm a Chicago PhD economist. All right, so this is the picture of what we're trying to do in terms that are sort of familiar to no one, but familiar to everyone. This technology, which trades off the privacy loss, epsilon from differential privacy, against the accuracy, is what the engineers are trying to design. They're trying to find differentially private systems that deliver increasingly better production possibility frontiers. But what the Data Stewardship Executive Policy Committee is supposed to do is choose the point. And I've just illustrated one. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this example, but you're trying to find these points, all right? And that's a hard problem. And it's a problem to which computer science contributes the technology and economics contributes the preferences and the solution concept, right? I am not going to do any of the computer science in this crowd. You all know that the original differential privacy paper defined a protection specifically designed to quantify how resistant to a database reconstruction attack any particular publication was, all right? Okay. The key thing that we have to focus on, step back here so I don't have to keep looking up. The key thing that we have to focus on is the sufficient condition was that there be some randomization. All right? The necessary and sufficient conditions are that that randomization meet particular limits. All right? In addition to meeting those limits, the different technologies give accuracy measures that are associated with values of epsilon. All right? We're using two. We're using the expected normalized total variation distance, which has a very nice interpretation that's comparable to swapping rates, which is the historical method for protecting the census. And we're using the expected statistical variance compared to the variance of the same tabulation in the confidential data. An important thing to point out in the applications at the Census Bureau is that we have normalized these comparisons so that they aren't in the clear. They are relative to what would be published if the data weren't protected at all. So we're specifically measuring the accuracy associated with the protection system. All right? So a lot of people talk about randomized response. It has a very nice trade-off between the accuracy relative to perfect publication, which is the 1, for different values of epsilon.
I couldn't understand what you said on the last slide, and I think it's important. May I ask you to just explain the normalization again?
So I called Aaron Roth out on this last week. You publish theorems that have big O, and it turns out that when you use those big O proofs, it looks like differential privacy and sampling theory give about they literally do give the same big O error rate for the statistic in some cases. But the ratio of the differentially private statistic to the non-protected statistic is not capital O. It finite in all population sizes. It depends upon epsilon, and its dependence upon epsilon decays smoothly like this. All right, that's what I meant, and that's important because until I got the math stats at the Census Bureau to understand that it was the ratio or some other normalization, the difference also works, that they needed to pay attention to and not all these big O factors, they didn't understand the point I was trying to make. All right? So for protecting the end-to-end test, we are using we're actually using the geometric mechanism, but I'm going to illustrate it with the Laplace mechanism on a gigantic sensitivity 1 query, which is the block level redistricting data that are then pumped into every state and local redistricting plan. Normally, these redistricting data have to be released by April 1st of the year following the census, so April 1st, 2021. The test redistricting data are scheduled for release in February of 2019. All right. Okay. In 2010, those data were used to draw these congressional districts. Then I last gave this talk in Georgia. So these legislative districts in Georgia, and I was at Georgia Tech, and so these districts for the Georgia City Council, all right? But every single legislative district in the country uses these. And they're published at the block level, and this is a thermal map of those blocks that have no people in them. And all the blocks that are not dark green have people in them. There were 11 million such blocks in 2011. There'll be about 8 million in 2020. All right. For the system that we actually engineered, this is the technical trade-off between epsilon and that first accuracy measure, the one that's comparable to a swap rate. So if if you choose epsilon of 3, it's equivalent to swapping about 5% of the data. Choose epsilon of 4, it's equivalent to swapping about 3% of the data. So I'm not going to explain swapping. If you don't know what it is, just look at the accuracy measure. If I choose epsilon 6, it's basically equivalent to publishing the data with full accuracy, okay? My colleagues are going to have to pick a point. This is illustrated for a block with 20 people on it. Okay? So the disclosure avoidance system that you use in something like the census of population is a technology. And economics, forecasting, and disclosure limitation all have different ways of talking about exactly the same technology, but none of them have a way to select an optimal point on that technology. I need an optimal point here. And Cynthia has opined on multiple occasions that you might go as high as log 3. That's on a previous chart, that's 1.1 on the epsilon, all right? When we actually implemented this, the Census Bureau was the first agency in the world to implement a differentially private system in production. We used an epsilon of 8.9, which compared to what's being done by Apple and Google doesn't look so bad anymore. It does have a failure rate of 1 in a million, okay? All right. All these settings are differentially private, but they don't all imply the same control on the global disclosure risk, right? I like to say that down at the bottom there is where computer scientists think that the marginal social cost equals the marginal social benefit, and up nearer to the 5.5, 6 is where social scientists act like marginal social cost equals marginal social benefit. And there is no right answer from either economics or computer scientist about where you should be, all right? So we've been trying to help think about this social choice problem. And you can estimate that marginal social cost curve. I'll be frank with you, the data that we use to estimate it are not fantastic, but they are real data. And so that would be one way of doing it. But as it turns out, this use case that I'm talking about of redistricting really focuses a tight laser on what you need to worry about. So there's a Supreme Court ruling that says an electoral district must be one person, one vote, and the tolerance on that is incredibly small, 5 people. And so that has been interpreted for several decades now as not permitting disclosure avoidance on the actual population counts. And so as a matter of policy, the Data Stewardship Executive Policy Committee has declared that in the 2020 census that will remain true. The population totals at any level of geography are considered public. Okay. The Voting Rights Act, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, says that if it is possible, if in the overall legislative body that you're studying, a particular minority could be expected to elect at least one representative on some proportional representation criterion, then you must make it possible when you district for such a majority-minority district to come into being. The redistricting data contain race and ethnicity data that are used to enforce Section 2. They are the official enforcers of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. But we've protected those racial data with disclosure limitations since 2000. They were not protected in 1990. All right. So the accuracy is how to support these two criteria, and the privacy is the Title 13 requirement that that single Arab origin family in the middle of an otherwise ethnically different community can't be identifiable from the publication data. As far as I'm concerned, there's no player left standing except differential privacy to try to arbitrate between these. All right. Here's the much harder problem that my colleagues are now wrestling with. They would like to be able to produce those redistricting data just as fast as possible. So what's the fastest way to produce them? The fastest way to produce them is to randomize the inputs the way Google and Apple do on the way in the door with randomized response. Well, that's this PPF. Okay. At every level of epsilon, it has inferior accuracy to the other two, which I haven't told you what they are, but I will in a second. All right. Another way it could be done is to speed up the editing of the race and ethnicity data and the declaration that someone is voting age or not voting age. We're also not protecting whether the voting age population, because of an agreement with the Department of Justice. So that's also public. So this green line is basically what we're doing for the end-to-end test, because the only thing that's being published is the redistricting data. It's a compromise between local differential privacy and central differential privacy. It works at the block level to impose differential privacy and then aggregates up. It outperforms randomized response, but it doesn't outperform the system that's being engineered for the 2020 census, which is based in the latest iteration on matrix mechanism analysis of the entire workload from the redistricting data and summary file 1 to produce it with the most accurate outcomes with any given level of epsilon. All right? So my colleagues are going to have to decide whether we slow down the production of the public use data in time to get enough information to do this, or we impose on every calculation that's done from the census this loss of accuracy in order to speed up the production. And that is not an easy decision, and not one that is informed by the technology itself. It's clearly a policy decision. How important is it to get the data into the redistricting offices early? Okay. All right, so what are my takeaways? This is incredible new ground for official statisticians. They are not used to thinking about a privacy loss budget or how it would affect their operations, but it's not new grounds in terms of methodology. When sampling came into official statistics, all of these things, same things had to happen. In fact, one of my colleagues, Tommy Wright, has a lovely presentation with quotes from statisticians from the 19th century about how ridiculously stupid it was to use sampling as an alternative to censuses. So we'll get there, all right? But we're not going to get there alone. Many people in this room have supplied enormous help, and I appeal for more help. Thank you very much.
We can take a question.
I have a quick question about how you think about evaluating social welfare in regard to accuracy. What types of things do you bring into your equations when you think about that?
So we do have a very elaborate mathematical model for developing a social welfare function. And 3 out of 6 referees weren't so displeased with it, but everybody acknowledges that is extremely hard to do. So you have to motivate why the citizens would care about the accuracy at all. So they have to care about something that you can't learn from the statistic itself. From looking. So if you care about your position in the income distribution, then you need information about that income distribution so you can compare yourself to it, okay? That means that you need to know some other people's incomes, all right? That brings the privacy loss calculation in, and the accuracy of the calculation about the other people's income into the social welfare function, because that's a statistic that you need to know. You can do the same thing with health statistics. If you want to know whether a particular diagnosis plan is, treatment plan is effective, then you need some statistics from other people in order to evaluate that. But that also means that you have to be willing to contribute data, or somebody has to be willing to contribute data. So that's the motivation. For the redistricting one, you want to protect minority rights, which means you want accuracy in the redistricting data, but you also want to protect the minorities from misuses of the redistricting block level calculations, which are not unheard of. And so the formal protections are going to matter a lot if you're a small minority buried away someplace.
Thanks again, John.
Sure.
So our next speaker is Untitled Chapter from Nsf, and she will tell us about privacy and health data.
Well, thank you the organizers for the invitation and for not putting me just before lunch. Can you hear me now? Is it working? It is. All right. So I will not go over the HIPAA de-identified data definition again, because all of you know about it. And there's also the expert determination. As you know, those still are in the privacy rule and they persist. There's also limited data sets that are so-called de-identified without the 18 identifiers plus minus dates, I should say. You remove dates, they are de-identified. If you put back dates in, they're limited data sets. And why is that important? Because this can be shared without patient's consent, and they, as you all know, can be re-identified. Patient privacy is a major concern when sharing data, and several years ago we launched a National Center for Biomedical Computing focused on data sharing and analysis, which Cynthia worked as an advisor and brought to clinical care and biomedical research differential privacy, which was until then, I believe, not very understood or utilized. So the Center for Sharing Human Data has to deal with the technology and also the policies that go with it. And this is human subjects data related to clinical care and also related to clinical research. So in this room, I would like to ask who here had their electronic data, electronic health records shared for research? I would say almost everyone, except you don't know that. And it's shared in different ways. And I don't subscribe to the alarmist approach to it, that this is all bad and this is behind your backs. And it's not. But also, you know, there are ways that it's done, and there are ways that we developed in the center. So we decided we would have a center that would share human subjects data, including identified if permitted. And this worked with a data contributor agreement to the University of California, and then a data use agreement that would determine the conditions of those accesses. And the use doesn't mean download data, it means that you're accessing data for some purpose. And these data use agreements, as commented before, are signed by the institutions, and they involve lawyers, and sometimes they involve more negotiations. But with the data contributor agreement, that is already a data lawyer at the owner's side, that facilitates quite a bit. And the data use agreement is signed by the institution that wants to access the data. So who ended up contributing human subjects data to IDASH? PIs from studies in which patient consent permitted that kind of sharing. PIs who did not have funds to host the data beyond the study did not have funds to do the distribution. That is, every time someone asked, a data use agreement would have to be generated and so on. So they didn't want to deal with the individual requests. And also, they didn't want to set up a HIPAA-compliant environment for sharing, because that is necessary as well, not only to host, but how to transmit if transmissions are allowed, or how to authorize access. The repository ran for as many years as the center was funded. And we indexed those data sets in terms of their metadata of the data set, but not in terms of the data themselves. And this constitutes a problem that I'll just illustrate here. If you want to find all data about low-grade astrocytomas with IDH mutations, you can go to what we have now, a working data search engine called datamed.org, and you will find databases in which the metadata indicates that astrocytomas are there, and low grade, and IDH mutations probably. However, these are not the best data sets for this investigation. For example, we found one that has 131 diffuse astrocytomas. This is very tiny You know, you will not draw inferences from a small data set like this one. Instead, you want many thousands, many millions sometimes. And that's something that the All of Us Precision Medicine Initiative is trying to achieve. We'll have at least 1 million volunteers contributing electronic health records data, contributing blood samples and personal measurements in order to create a large and shareable database. In California, we lead the California Precision Medicine Consortium, which has 6 institutions which will recruit about 100,000 individuals for this program. However, this program is not necessarily illustrative of clinical research and other research that's going on because the patient consent is very broad. Usually, the patient consent in studies is not that broad, meaning sometimes there are conditions, many times there are conditions such as the data should only be used for research in X, example, cancer or multiple sclerosis and so on. So we ran into trouble when trying to index data sets like that because we're not even permitted access to the data themselves, just to the envelope. Indexing data so data sets can be found shouldn't count as research, but unfortunately, data access committees from dbGaP and other very large repositories would consider that to be so. Sometimes you have only studies in which institution Y participates. No study of ancestry in many of these studies, and also the destruction of data being necessary. So there are several things about clinical research that make impediments in order to share data, which is desirable as long as privacy is somewhat protected or protected to the extent that we can. I make an arbitrary categorization here, which is probably not right, but it helps put some technologies in particular bins, which I would call data-centric and institution people-centric, which would be more policies than technology here. But I wanted everyone to know why your medical records have been shared, because the current structure is the institution that holds your records decides whether it's a valid research that is being proposed or not, and how this could be shared. So it serves as a trusted broker for data use agreements if necessary, and a user or a researcher can request data and can even download those data under different circumstances. There are HIPAA waivers that can be provided if it's considered impractical to reach you back to ask if your records could be used. So we are using such approach in a clinical data research network that we lead out of University of San Diego, but involves 14 health systems and about 30 million people's records in there. Some of whom are deceased already, but includes the large VA National Enterprise Data Warehouse. And as you can see, is a federated model. Everyone keeps their records, but we do research, clinical effectiveness research on top of this data. The Boston area has another similar research network, which is why I believe your records have been in some way been accessed for some type of research. How this works, federated data, we have distributed analytics. You have to have a common data model, of course, and minimal computational infrastructure, compatible institutional policies, agreements on the rules of engagement, shared ethical principles, and obviously access only to the portions of data that are needed. So during the course of this workshop, you will see multiple aspects of it. Is it ethical to share because you have not explicitly been asked and you don't know who is sharing what? Is it ethical not to share, an approach that several clinical researchers espouse, that new discoveries and acceleration of science depend on sharing? I would say even patient safety depends on sharing. If you find a defective product or an adverse event that was not revealed in studies, following and surveilling those data might save a lot of people from complications or even from life-threatening events. So what happens today is that a patient can request removal of their records for research. This is at UCSD, happens once or twice per year. And it's an all or nothing. You have to remove absolutely everything. So instead of that, we thought we could come back with another system in which the patient could decide. And the patient could decide, do I wish to disclose data to you? And then I can look up. And I say, well, it's been shared too much. I want to reduce that. That could be done. And on data categories, not everything. So this was very controversial in our organization because currently, as long as data are de-identified or are limited data sets and you obtain a HIPAA waiver, you don't need to ask anybody. But we wanted to see what people actually think. First, they didn't know the data were shared, so that was a revelation. And then, do they care? Because many people said, well, people don't care, why are you even asking? So some clinics refused to participate that we approached. They said the researchers also were concerned because currently they can use data that way. And if I ask, maybe people will not allow. Research could be affected. Fewer, the sample sizes could be small if everyone withdraws. And wrong inferences could be made because certain parts of the population might be taking out their data, and that might be necessary. So someone's opinion, not ours. Also was, when I disclosed this, I said, well, patients can remove certain categories, but there's no guarantee that you cannot infer data from those categories from the data they live there. And this is very explicit in our consent for this study on consent. And someone said, if you can't ensure 100% that nothing can be inferred about the data elements that they want removed, then you better do nothing and just leave it as it is, because you're not giving a false sense of security or making people confident that that data will not be disclosed. And I had an issue with this, which was a panel of advisories to our Clinical Research Institute. And I said, well, you are clinical researchers, let me ask ethics people about what they think. Because currently you can share, and people, have nothing protected. We are proposing something that protects a little bit more than currently, but is not perfect. And we have a disclaimer for that. So in my mind, there was nothing wrong about doing it. The clinical researchers were, concerned, so we assembled a panel of 5 ethics experts from different institutions, and they concluded that you should do as much as you can, even though it's not perfect, because otherwise you'll never advance this area anyways. So we were very happy to be able to continue the research, and we put our consent management system to interface with the clinical data warehouse, which is an extract from the electronic health record system. And we provided choices. Currently, this is the choice. Everything is checked for you because you can release those data because they're not identifiers, correct? Except age over 89. But again, we wanted to see if people wanted to remove because of institutions and which items they were most concerned about, because some items seldom appear in research questions. Some others appear very frequently. So we did this interface, which now has changed a little bit, has also been simplified. And if you scroll down, you would see all the categories that we had there. And this was informed by previous studies on what people consider sensitive data. Circled in red are the categories that the Precision Medicine Initiative wanted to collect: vital signs, tissue and blood samples for genetics tests, and so on. So we asked that of it's a pilot study, so it was a small sample size, but we wanted to know first if people would want to go to this interface and make selections, and then which selections they made, so we would know if it would impact research. So here are the results, and I know that this graph is not the most appropriate one, but it's just for impact. It's for you to see that items that were declined frequently were related to income, to billing records, to mental health, both own and of family members. And also there were some related to substance abuse, but they varied according to the individuals. This is the aggregate for all individuals. And then per item, this color code here, the light blue is what precision medicine needs. That is, people want to share everything. They are totally fine. They don't want to remove that particular item. But the purple and orange are items that as long as your institution is involved or a nonprofit institution is involved leading the research, people are willing to volunteer that information as well. And then on red is the percent that didn't want to share a particular item. On the left-hand side, again, from the pilot of 1,000 individuals that we approached, only 124 actually wanted to participate, wanted to go to the system and make selections. And this is the selections they did. So less than 5%, and pardon my English here, is also for effect, they didn't want to share anything with anybody. And these are the withdrawals that people were all concerned about. Others were willing to share everything with everybody. They left it exactly what it was. They read the information and so on and decided to keep it like that. And then 43 of those, or 76 of those, wanted to remove something. And again, the removals are not for everything, right? Some want to remove this, but not that, and so on. So, of course, too early to say how research would be impacted, but most research does not involve billing, for example. So that we might not be concerned about. Some research does not involve mental health. So that also is another thing that we need to consider, or income. So there are ways to get people a little bit more reassured of what's happening, a little bit more control is not total control, as I mentioned before, so that they feel better about it. So this is a couple of the questions we asked afterwards. Does having these choices make you feel differently about sharing? And some said they're more willing to share now that they see what's happening. We also asked, how does your willingness to share medical data for healthcare compared to sharing for research? And this is a follow-up from a study we had before, in which we discovered people were more willing to share for research than for healthcare, which seems counterintuitive, but I think it is a product of the healthcare system and the insurance system. So there might be some things that people don't want to share because of coverage and so on. So we need to investigate that more. Do you feel more comfortable if you know who is using your data? And that's definitely an important thing. People are very much worried on who receives the data, more than the outcomes of the research, more than the titles, et cetera. And if you could, this was very surprising to me because my choice would have been very different. If you could receive an update each time someone uses your medical data for research, would you like to be notified? And my guess is no. I would like to go to a website periodically and see what's happening. But look at folks here. They want to be notified every single time. So this might become very interesting. It might become the spam of research if it starts being used several times, but it is an educational process. And our hypothesis was that if people see what's been used for, they will be more comforted than if they don't see and it's all this mystery about things. So to conclude, asking people is not a bad idea. And from the previous talk, I mean, I can see a day where even people could decide their privacy level that they want, their budget, their own comfort level with that. It will take time, but it's possible. And I think that's the beauty of the differential privacy framework, that individuals could have some more control of that and quantifiable. So I just want to quickly acknowledge some funding sources and then leave with this slide that asking people might not be a bad idea. Thank you.
Do we have a question?
When you allow sort of this kind of opt-in use of sharing of individual records, how do you, does it create sort of selection effects that are hard to account for when you're actually doing analysis, right? Or do certain types of people volunteer their data more readily than others? I would assume there are strong effects.
Well, we thought so too, but our sample size was so small that we couldn't conclude. Then we applied for another grant to enlarge the study to another institution and have 10 times more people making selections. That might still, depending on the groups, not be powered enough to answer those questions. It's a preoccupation. So we also wanted, as in the prior example, provide a means to quantify, you know, what's the difference if were the real data and what's the data that we will be providing for the researcher to have a sense of, I'm just getting 50% of the records. And so that's our next phase. So we have recruited about 800 people now. Our goal is 1,200, so we'll hopefully have more answers next time.
Thanks again.
All right, thank you.
Our last speaker for this session is Mayan on the other side of the river, and he will tell us about some of the interesting stuff there.
Thank you to the organizers for inviting me, and thank you especially for actually giving me the talk before lunch. I want to talk to you today about sort of a new project that I'm a lead PI of, but there's a bunch of others in the room who are working on, such as Merce Crosas and Oran Krieger and many other co-PIs as well. And so it's about combining some of the efforts from this frontier project and also from a different frontier project called a modular approach to cloud security. So if there's anyone from the NSF here and you have your like frontier project bingo card, this project will check a lot of those boxes. Okay, so this is a, oops, does this work? No, okay. This is a cyber infrastructure project that combines 3 different efforts, and I sort of alluded to them all in the title, but the title is long and generic, so let me describe in more detail. What we want to do in this project is build an infrastructure that combines the scientific data available on Dataverse with the ability to analyze, to compute directly over this data in a cloud, production cloud environment, such as the Massachusetts Open Cloud, in a way that preserves privacy and security and trust relationships, specifically using a cryptographically secure method of computing called secure multi-party computation. And in this talk, I'm going to describe what all 3 of these pieces are individually, and then how and why we are combining them together. And I'll start with Dataverse, which is the easiest for me to cover because Merce already talked about it earlier this morning. So I just have this one slide refresher here about what Dataverse is. It's one of the largest public repositories of scientific, like social science and life science data available today. There's, you know, a bunch of contributors of data sets, many tens of thousands of data sets uploaded, and B, a bunch of people who are interested in this data, many millions of downloads. I want to focus on the download part first which I'm going to claim is a little bit of both a blessing and a curse. It's a very nice blessing that the Dataverse project is storing data that's so valuable that there's many people who are interested in downloading it. On the other hand, a little bit of on the curse side is the fact that they actually have to download this data in the first place. This data can be rather large. It can be in the potentially small numbers of gigabytes worth of data, and it would be nice if rather than having these individuals have to download the data in order to make use of it, that they could actually run computations where the data actually live already. And this is the goal of a project called Cloud Dataverse, which is a joint endeavor between Harvard and BU, which extends the Dataverse system so that exactly the data within Dataverse can be stored in an environment called Nsf, which is a common place where objects are stored on cloud computing systems, so the data are stored in a way that cloud computing frameworks understand it. Popular open source cloud software packages such as OpenStack understand it, and then we can add a compute button right next to the data set so that if you want to have access to this data set rather than downloading it, you can say where the data set already lives, say it lives on the cloud, I want to then just spin up a cloud computing instance to run my analytic where it lives. I don't need to download the many gigabytes worth of data. I just need to upload a computation to be performed over that data and then have the results of that computation downloaded to me. Okay, so it's about combining the power of cloud computing and storage with access to thousands of data sets from the Dataverse system. In principle, this endeavor of combining Dataverse with the cloud computing infrastructure could be done with any production cloud environment, but in particular, we're using here the Massachusetts Open Cloud, which is relevant for a couple of specific reasons why this is a nice place to do it. So let me also then spend a few minutes next describing what the Massachusetts Open Cloud is. And I'll describe it by way of juxtaposition to the way that major commercial cloud providing services such as Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure or Google Cloud's compute works. Those tend to be, those are monolithic in nature. Okay, if I want to do some work on Amazon Web Services, Amazon owns every single part of that infrastructure. They own the physical hardware, the computing devices, the hard drives, the network, et cetera, that all my computations are done on. They also control the entire software infrastructure. They control the hypervisor on which my virtual machine lives. They control the method in which, like say, scheduling and load balancing methods that determine where my VM actually lives in the cloud in the first place or which data center it goes to, et cetera. So they control all aspects of this. And we think this is bad for a variety of reasons, some of which are relevant to this talk and some just more generally. So I'll say a bunch of reasons why this might not be an optimal way that cloud computing works nowadays. One is that by having this sort of oligopoly with a very small number of participants in this marketplace, it limits the ability to have research and innovation in this space. It's very hard to form a cloud computing startup if you have an idea of how to innovate in cloud computing if just to get off the ground you need to spend, say, $100 million to build a data center to test out whether your ideas even work. It also provides what I'll call somewhat hyperbolically like a one-size-fits-none security guarantee, which is not to say that the security provided on cloud providers today is bad. It's just that it may simultaneously be too strong and too weak for your interests. You might be paying, it might have certain aspects where it's stronger than you actually require for a particular application, in which case you're wasting money on CPU cycles that are protecting you from something you may not care about. And on the other hand, it may be too weak for your interest and you may be unwilling to use the cloud because you have data or computing that's so sensitive that you might not be willing to use it. And finally, there's the vendor lock-in problem that it's hard to sort of migrate from one cloud to another if you decide you dislike it. Oran likes to use this analogy, Oran uses this analogy, which I like very much, which says that the cloud computing world right now is what the world of accessing just connectivity online was in sort of the early 1990s, the pre-internet world where everyone connected through sort of an AOL or a CompuServe or some sort of portal that only showed you selected things that they've curated. And as someone who usually speaks to students and postdocs, it's nice to talk to an audience for a change that's old enough to remember what AOL and CompuServe were. But anyway. By way of juxtaposing that, the Open Cloud Exchange model, which Oran and Azur Bestavros at BU came up with this idea, it sort of envisions a federated world in which there are multiple providers at all layers of the cloud. There's sort of this really hard to see cloud that sort of connects all these, but whatever. It looks nice on this computer. So multiple providers at every single level of the stack. So multiple computing providers, storage providers, networking providers, and software providers that provide the infrastructure as a service or other kinds of services that connect all these pieces together. And users can mix and match amongst these components to pick exactly which services they wish to use, or to put it a different way, which services they trust to operate on their data properly, where properly means both correctly and securely and privately. And this decision, this trust decision, is revocable. It's changeable. If you just decide to change your mind, you can simply migrate to another one of the providers. And if this choice is sort of overbearing for you and you don't know what to pick, there's sort of an economic marketplace that can form of brokers or intermediaries that can help you to figure out which services to mix and match that will be optimized for particular applications, such as if you want to build a website, or you want high-performance computing, or you want to set up a big data stack. So that's the idea. The instantiation of this was in the Massachusetts Open Cloud. It was initially set up in the summer of 2014. There's like a press release announcing it with former Governor Deval Patrick, who provided the initial, the Commonwealth provided the initial seed funding. There's the governor together with, there's a picture of Azur, and this is a partial picture of Oran, who's doing his best to maintain his privacy by getting out of the frame of the shot. Anyway, so this is the instantiation. They've worked for the past 3.5 years to make this a reality, have a variety, a very large corpus of industrial and government sponsors and partners and collaborators, from people who help to provide computing services such as Lenovo and Dell, people who provide networking services such as Juniper and Cisco and Brocade, consumers who are interested in sort of migrating secure application or privacy-sensitive conscious applications to the cloud, such as Two Sigma, which is a finance industry, a New York financial firm, and the U.S. Air Force at Hanscom Air Force Base out in Lexington. So this is an open cloud that's trying to realize this, this federated trust model. And so that's the second component of what we're trying to put together. There's one more component, and then I'll show you why we want to put these things together. The final thing we want to sort of throw into our like soup of things we're mixing in this project is called secure multi-party computation. What is MPC? So the problem, the cryptographic problem that MPC tries to solve is, what if you have a collection of computers that each are storing different data sets, and they want to compute some sort of analytic over them. This could be any kind of analytic, such as a linear regression or machine learning or anything else. And somehow they want to do this while talking to each other, and they want to learn the answer to this analytic. There's a variety of ways in which, in principle, they could solve this problem, including just by giving their data to each other. But MPC tries to solve the problem differently in such a way that it looks as if these people were simply feeding their data into some sort of black box that computes the analytic for them. And this analytic could be anything, but in particular it could be, and following the theme of today, it could be some sort of differentially private analysis, where differential privacy, its goal is to sort of protect the privacy of input data, this A, B, and C, from the recipient of the analytic. And MPC put on top of this could additionally make it so that the folks who, the curator or curators who host the data also do not see, your private sensitive data are also not revealed to them. So that's the goal. In the interest, oh, right, sorry. So to recap, sort of the objective of this cryptographic technology is to federate trust in data and computing amongst several computing entities who can jointly compute over your data in a way that, if they were all in cahoots together, they would actually learn your data, but as long as they're independent and you can trust at least one or some number of them not to breach to the other parties, that your input data is safe, Performance-wise, the main bottleneck of secure multi-party computation is networking costs. In the interest of time, I'll skip sort of my description of how MPC actually works, but it induces both computing and networking overheads, but I'm going to claim without proof that the networking costs in practice often are the bottleneck. Okay. So there are many engines for doing this cryptographic technology, this secure multi-party computation. The specific one that we want to use in this project is one that we've built at Boston University called Conclave. So Conclave is a system that enables this secure multi-party computation, this cryptographically secure computing at scale. It makes three fundamental flavors of advances on top of existing MPC libraries that have been out there in the public domain for approximately a decade or so. Researchers have been building this. The three innovations are, first, it allows you to use, to leverage existing backends. So most MPC software in the past has been sort of written for cryptographers by cryptographers for cryptographers. And when you talk to the people who build this, they say this with affection, and I'm not really sure why. So, you know, like you actually want to build this secure computing technology so it can be used by others in the world. And one thing I know is that if I go to any company ever in history and say, here's the secure computing software, all you have to do is migrate all of your data from however you currently store it to my software, then I'll just be laughed out the door. So, so what this system does, it allows you to connect to data stored on a variety of popular backends such as Hadoop and Apache Spark and Naiad and a few others. The second thing it does is it allows you to program the analytic, that F, that you want to compute in a SQL-like programming language. It's currently this domain-specific language, but we're trying to remove the like part. And hopefully in the next year or so, or actually sooner than that, hopefully, we'll actually just take in analytics as input in SQL itself. So the analyst who types in the input does not need to have any MPC experience, just experience using a language that was built to support structured queries and that people have liked since the 70s. And the third innovation it makes is a performance innovation, which is it uses techniques from static analysis to sort of discern which parts of a computation need to be conducted under this secure multi-party computation, which is slower than running computing natively. And so what it tries to do is it sort of, on the one hand, tries to figure out all of the information, all of the parts, like sub-pieces of a computation that can be performed locally by each of the parties before any sort of aggregation and mixing needs to be done. And on the other hand, on the backside, sort of tries to infer any sort of final computations that are bijections from the output and therefore reveal no more information than the eventual output would have revealed anyway, which is something that when you actually ask a crypto person to like optimize MPC for a particular application, this is probably one of the first things they would do, but the whole point is that this is automated, and so it's something that's done without the need for human intervention. Okay, so I've described these three technologies, and now I'm going to describe how and why we're putting them together in this grant. So by sort of integrating Dataverse with this Conclave secure computing system, we think that we get like some nice benefits here sort of on the input level. Conclave in principle allows you to compute over any data securely. But Dataverse is where a lot of this data actually live. So at the input level, the point of integrating these two systems is to bring secure computing ideas to where the data already live in practice. And on the output level, when Conclave produces the result of some sort of statistical analysis, we don't really know what to do with this information, and this is nice where Dataverse has not only a place in which to store the derived data product, but also the whole data tags mechanism that Mersey described earlier to try to understand what is the sensitivity of the derived data and how should it be handled, and also a provenance mechanism to allow us to remember that the derived product comes from these particular inputs and so on. It has a lot of the infrastructure to sort of maintain this data and make it accessible and protected going forward. Which is what we would want. Also, from the point of view of connecting this idea of an open cloud with Conclave, they are very synergistic in the sense that they both try to solve sort of the same kind of problem in terms of allowing a user to isolate her trust into only the components of the cloud that she chooses to entrust, that she likes. If there are multiple providers on the MOC and you only want your data to be stored in one of them, you have full choice over dictating that, and none of the other systems will ever learn what's going on. And Conclave, because it's a secure multi-party computation system, has the same flavor. You can outsource your data to whichever party doing the computation you want, and you can choose to entrust whichever one you want with making sure that your data is safe while computing. And also, the other reason why this is a nice combination is from a performance reason. So if you remember what I said earlier about secure multi-party computation, its big bottleneck is networking. And most of pretty much all of the prior papers in the secure multi-party computation space measure performance at levels of, say, either over the internet, sort of a wide area network scale, or maybe a gigabit LAN. But by being able to have a multi-provider cloud in a single building, in a single data set, we can get much faster, lower latency, higher throughput communications than we could in any real application of MPC in the past. And so, yeah, by putting these pieces together, we think that we have a technology that really allows us to do secure private computing at scale by sort of allowing everybody who's involved in the pipeline, from contributors of data to analysts of data to policy experts who try to derive rules around data, to be able to solve all of their problems in a way that scales over multiple applications. So let me conclude with like an envisioned workflow that we have. The example that I have here is from a medical application, and it's not entirely something that we're not doing literally what I'm saying, but we're talking with several medical researchers and trauma centers about doing something similar to this. So the envisioned workflow that I depict here has two pieces. First, a data upload piece, and then an analysis piece. In the upload piece, we have some hospitals which maybe have some data that's, say, protected by HIPAA or something like this. And say, here's a hospital, Boston Children's Hospital, and they want to, say, upload their data to the cloud so that it can be leveraged by researchers. And we want to build a system that allows them to upload it to Cloud Dataverse in a way that the data is always encrypted when stored in this Ceph backend on Cloud Dataverse, and that Boston Children's Hospital can choose which of the providers in this multi-provider cloud they want to trust with their data. In my example here, because BCH happens to be affiliated with Harvard Medical Hospital, presumably it would make sense that they would trust the Harvard MOC pod with their data. And what I mean by that is they would entrust it to know the keys that are the secret keys that will decrypt this data. And similarly, here's a different hospital, MGH, with its own provider. Okay. And then at some point in the future, let's say some medical researcher wants to perform some sort of analysis over this data, then what it would do is display, state what its analytic is going to be, and then these pods, these two pods that are acting on behalf of the two hospitals that have now disappeared from the picture, they no longer now have to be online and active anymore, these pods should have stored these permissions that the hospitals may have provided, either from human or robot lawyers, to say what kinds of analyses are allowed to be performed over their data. Maybe, for instance, any analysis as long as it's differentially private with certain parameters, et cetera. And assuming this medical researcher's query complies with this, then the data, the encrypted data, would be pulled into the respective pods where they could be decrypted only inside the pods that the respective hospitals chose to entrust with their data. And then in the cloud itself, in this multi-provider cloud, we have this really high-speed MPC networking channel that we can use to run MPC to compute the overall analytic that is of interest to this medical researcher. And so in this way, we can allow this data to be exploited for use in ways that we don't think are possible currently through this intersection of blending these three technologies together. Thank you.